Have you ever wondered what happens when God's power flows through ordinary men in extraordinary ways? Tonight, you're about to discover the complete story of two of the Bible's most powerful prophets: Elijah, who called down fire from heaven, and Elisha, who performed twice as many miracles. From raising the dead to multiplying oil, from stopping armies to healing lepers, their intertwined stories reveal God's faithfulness across generations. As you drift off to sleep, let these timeless tales of faith, courage, and divine intervention wash over you. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if this type of content helps you unwind. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? A whisper on the wind. Desert winds carry stories across ancient hills. They whisper through valleys where shepherds once walked over stones that remember footsteps from long ago. In this land, between sea and wilderness, between promise and struggle, the air itself holds memory. The hills of Israel rise like sleeping giants beneath endless sky. Olive trees twist their silver branches toward heaven, their leaves catching light that has shone on this place for thousands of years. Below, in the valleys, wheat fields stretch golden in the morning sun. This is the land God promised to Abraham, the land Moses saw from afar, the land Joshua conquered with faith and sword. But something has shifted in the spiritual air. The wind carries more than dust now. It brings the scent of burning incense from foreign altars, the sound of chanting to gods with names like Baal and Asherah. The people who once walked with the God of Abraham now bow before carved images. They've forgotten the voice that split the Red Sea, the hand that fed them manna in the wilderness. King Ahab sits on his throne in Samaria, and the kingdom feels heavy under his rule. Not because of taxes or war, though those troubles exist too. The weight comes from something deeper, a spiritual darkness that settles over the land like fog over a lake. When people turn from God, even the earth seems to hold its breath. In the palace, Queen Jezebel speaks with authority that makes grown men step backward. She comes from Sidon, bringing with her the worship of Baal. Her voice carries the power of someone who has never doubted her own will. Under her influence, altars to foreign gods multiply like weeds after rain. The prophets of the Lord flee to caves or die by her sword. Yet heaven is not silent. In the courts of eternity, decisions are being made. Plans are set in motion. The God who spoke light into darkness prepares to send his voice into this troubled time, not through armies or earthquakes, but through a man, a prophet, someone who will stand before kings and speak truth without trembling. The wind picks up, stirring the dust of ancient roads. It blows through the hills of Gilead, past the Jordan River, toward a destiny that will shake the kingdom. Soon, very soon, a figure will emerge from the wilderness. A man whose very name means, "My God is Yahweh." His footsteps will echo through history. His words will call down fire from heaven. But for now, the wind simply whispers through the valleys. The olive trees bend and sway. The wheat fields wave like golden waves on a vast sea. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbles, though no clouds darken the sky. The storm is coming. The stage is set, and God is about to speak. In the silence between one breath and the next, change begins. It starts small, like a seed in good soil, like a whisper that grows into a shout, like a single raindrop that becomes a flood. The spiritual climate is about to shift. The sleeping kingdom is about to wake up. The troubled kingdom Israel should be a garden. Instead, it has become a wasteland of the spirit. Under King Ahab's 22-year reign, the nation has drifted far from the God who brought them out of Egypt. The drift began slowly, like a ship whose anchor slips in the night. Now the distance between heaven and earth seems vast as the desert. Ahab himself is not the worst king Israel has known, but he is weak where strength matters most. When it comes to his foreign wife, Jezebel, he bends like a reed in the wind. She speaks, and he listens. She commands, and he obeys. What began as political marriage has become spiritual surrender. Jezebel arrives from Sidon with more than royal robes and jewelry. She brings 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. These servants of foreign gods eat at her table, sleep in her palaces, and spread their worship throughout the land. They build high places on every hill. They carve poles and statues. They light fires to gods who cannot see or hear. The people watch their king's wife and think change is coming. If the palace worships new gods, perhaps they should too. Fear plays its part. Jezebel's sword has already tasted the blood of God's prophets. Speaking against Baal becomes dangerous. Safer to bow with the crowd than stand alone. Baal worship promises much: fertility for crops, rain for thirsty fields, prosperity for merchants and farmers. The ceremonies are loud and wild, full of dancing and cutting and shouting. They offer excitement that the quiet worship of Yahweh seems to lack. But promises and reality often walk different paths. The true prophets of God hide in caves like Obadiah's 100, fed on bread and water in secret places. Some flee to other kingdoms, others die rather than bow to Baal. The schools of the prophets that once thrived in Bethel and Jericho grow quiet. The voice of God seems distant as stars on a cloudy night. Yet even in darkness, covenant promises remain. God remembers his word to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. The oath made to David still stands firm as bedrock. Though Israel wanders like a lost sheep, the good shepherd has not forgotten his flock. Discipline may come, but destruction will not have the final word. The covenant includes both blessing and curse. Choose life and live. Choose death and die. Israel has chosen poorly, and the consequences follow like shadows at sunset. Drought hovers on the horizon like a promise no one wants to see fulfilled. The rains that should fall in their season wait for heaven's command. In the spiritual realm, battles rage beyond human sight. Angels of light war against powers of darkness. Principalities and authorities clash over the soul of a nation. What happens in palace and temple echoes in heavenly places. What is bound on earth reflects what is bound in heaven. Ahab sits in his ivory palace, surrounded by luxury bought with spiritual compromise. His walls shine with expensive decorations. His tables overflow with fine food and wine. But prosperity built on faithlessness resembles a house constructed on sand. When storms come, such buildings fall with great noise. The people go through the motions of their former faith. They still speak God's name, though quietly. They still remember the stories their grandparents told. Abraham's journey, Moses at the burning bush, David's songs. But memory without practice grows weak as winter sunlight. What is not used begins to die. Children grow up confused, learning prayers to Yahweh from their mothers and chants to Baal from their fathers. They see altars to both gods and wonder which one really rules. The confusion spreads like ripples in still water, each generation more uncertain than the last. Yet God's purposes cannot be shaken. His plans unfold according to his own timing. In the councils of heaven, a decision has been made. A prophet will rise, a voice will speak. The spiritual tide that has run so long toward darkness will turn back toward light. The stage is set for confrontation. Heaven's patience has limits. The time for gentle correction has passed. Now comes the thunder. Now comes the fire. Now comes the man who will stand before kings and speak the uncompromising word of the Lord. Enter Elijah the Tishbite. He appears without warning in Ahab's court, like lightning splitting a clear sky. No herald announces his coming. No messenger prepares the way. One moment, the throne room holds its usual collection of counselors and courtiers. The next, a stranger stands before the king of Israel. His clothes speak of wilderness and wind. His hair flows long and wild, touched by sun and storm. His eyes hold depths that make proud men look away. This is not a palace prophet, polished and careful with words. This is something else entirely, something dangerous and uncontained. The guards step forward, hands moving toward their swords. Who is this rough man who dares enter the royal presence uninvited? But something in his bearing stops them. He carries authority that has nothing to do with earthly power. When he speaks, even the air seems to listen. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the years to come except at my word. The declaration falls like a stone into still water. Ripples of shock spread through the assembled courtiers. Did this wild man just announce drought to the king of Israel? His name is Elijah the Tishbite, from Tishbe in Gilead. The meaning of his name carries its own prophecy. My God is Yahweh. In a kingdom where Baal is worshipped as Lord of storm and rain, this stranger claims the true God as his master. The challenge could not be clearer. Ahab's face darkens with anger, but before he can respond, the prophet turns and walks away. No bow to royal authority, no request for permission to leave. He simply goes, as suddenly as he came, leaving behind words that will echo through years of thirst and waiting. Elijah has lived most of his life east of the Jordan River in the rugged country of Gilead. Here, where the desert meets the sown land, a man learns to depend on God for everything. Water comes from hidden springs. Food grows scarce in the rocky soil. Only the strong survive, and only the faithful prosper. The hills of Gilead breed prophets like nowhere else. Perhaps it's the solitude that teaches men to hear God's voice. Perhaps it's the hardship that burns away everything except what truly matters. Or perhaps God simply chooses to speak more clearly in places where human noise grows quiet. Years of preparation have brought Elijah to this moment, years of learning to trust when circumstances make no sense, years of discovering that God's ways rise as high above human ways as heaven above earth. The wilderness has been his school, solitude his teacher, faith his graduation. Now he carries a message that will test everything he has learned. Drought is coming to Israel, not the ordinary dry season that farmers know and plan for. This will be drought beyond memory or hope. 3 years without rain, 3 years without dew, 3 years of watching the land crack and wither under merciless sun. The message sounds harsh, but it carries hope within its severity. Rain will return at Elijah's word. When the prophet speaks, the heavens will open. The key to Israel's deliverance rests in the hands of the man they will soon call enemy. Baal's worshippers claim their God controls the weather. Storm clouds obey his voice, lightning flashes at his command, rain falls when he chooses to bless the earth. But now they will learn the difference between carved stone and living God, between human imagination and divine reality. The drought will be Baal's test as much as Israel's. Let the rain god prove his power. Let his prophets call down water from heaven. Let his 450 servants dance and chant and cut themselves until blood flows like rivers. The sky will remain as brass, the earth will remain as iron, and Israel will learn who really rules the forces of nature. Elijah walks away from Samaria knowing his life has changed forever. There will be no quiet return to Gilead now. No peaceful years tending sheep or growing grain. He has thrown down the gauntlet before the most powerful people in the kingdom. From this day forward, he belongs to the storm he has announced. But he does not walk alone. The God who sent him into Ahab's presence will not abandon him in the wilderness to come. Provision waits in places no human eye has seen. Protection exists beyond the reach of royal swords. The journey ahead will test faith to its limits, but faith tested becomes faith strengthened. Behind him in the palace, confusion reigns. Who was that wild man? Where did he come from? What did he mean about drought? Ahab's counselors whisper among themselves like leaves in the wind. Only Jezebel remains silent, her eyes narrow with thought. She recognizes a threat when she sees one. The die is cast. The prophet has spoken. Heaven's will has been declared. Now comes the waiting. Now comes the testing. Now comes the proof of which God truly reigns over storm and sunshine, over blessing and curse, over the destiny of nations. Ravens and a brook, God's voice comes clear as morning light. Leave this place and turn eastward. Hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. Elijah obeys without question. He has learned that God's instructions often make little sense to human wisdom. Hide by a brook when you've just challenged the king. Trust ravens for daily bread. The ways of heaven remain mysteries that faith accepts without understanding. The journey takes him through familiar territory. These are the hills of his youth, the valleys where he learned to walk with God. Each stone seems to welcome him home. Each turn in the path holds memories of quieter days when being a prophet meant only speaking to sheep and wild donkeys. Kerith Ravine cuts deep into the landscape like a wound that has healed into beauty. Water trickles down its rocky walls, gathering into pools before flowing on toward the Jordan. Oleander bushes bloom pink and white along the banks. Fig trees stretch their branches over hidden springs. In a land about to burn with drought, this place will remain green as Eden. Elijah builds a simple shelter among the rocks. No palace walls to protect him here. No servants to attend his needs. Just stone and sky and the sound of running water. The simplicity feels like freedom after the weight of royal courts and their heavy air of intrigue. The ravens come as God promised, black wings against blue sky, carrying bread and meat in their beaks. They arrive morning and evening, regular as sunrise and sunset, never too early, never too late, always enough, never too much. Heaven's catering service operates with precision no earthly kitchen could match. These are not ordinary ravens. God has commanded them, and they obey with perfect faithfulness. No storm keeps them from their mission. No predator frightens them from their task. They become living proof that all creation serves its maker's will. What seems impossible to human eyes appears natural to creatures who have never forgotten their place in God's order. Elijah drinks from the brook and eats what the ravens bring. The bread tastes sweet as honey. The meat satisfies like nothing he has known before. Not because the food itself is special, but because it comes directly from God's hand. Every bite carries the flavor of divine provision. Days pass in peaceful rhythm. Morning prayer by the water's edge. Afternoon rest in the shade of overhanging rocks. Evening meditation as stars appear overhead. The noise of the kingdom seems far away as a half-remembered dream. Here, only essentials matter. Water, food, God's presence. The rest falls away like leaves in autumn wind. But this is more than just hiding from Ahab's anger. This is schooling in trust. Every morning when Elijah wakes, he must believe that ravens will come. Every evening when his stomach growls, he must wait for wings in the sky. No storage rooms full of grain here. No backup plans or emergency supplies. Only daily dependence on God's faithfulness. The drought he announced begins to bite. Reports filter in through traveling merchants and refugees. Wells dry up in towns he knows by name. Streams that have flowed for generations shrink to muddy trickles. Farmers watch their crops wither in fields that once waved green with promise. King Ahab searches everywhere for the prophet who brought this curse upon the land. His soldiers comb the hills. His spies question every traveler. Foreign kings receive messages asking if they have seen a wild man with fire in his eyes. But Elijah remains hidden as a stone in deep water. God's protection surrounds him like an invisible wall. The brook continues to flow while rivers fail throughout Israel. Its water tastes clean and cold even as dust storms blow across the dying land. The oleanders bloom while gardens wither. The fig trees bear fruit while orchards stand bare. This small corner of creation remains blessed while judgment falls on the nation. Ravens continue their faithful service. Morning and evening, they arrive with provisions. No day passes without their gifts. Even as food grows scarce throughout the kingdom, Elijah's table never lacks. The God who feeds sparrows has not forgotten his prophet. Time moves differently in the ravine. Without royal schedules or priestly duties, Elijah learns to live by heaven's clock. He rises with the sun and sleeps with the stars. He prays when the Spirit moves and rests when peace descends. The artificial urgency of human kingdoms gives way to the eternal rhythms of God's presence. Yet he knows this season will not last forever. The drought serves a purpose larger than his own safety. Israel must learn that Baal cannot bring rain. The prophets of false gods must face their powerlessness. King Ahab must discover that political authority means nothing when heaven withholds its blessing. So Elijah waits by the brook and trusts the ravens. He drinks from waters that flow by divine command. He eats bread that comes from heaven's storehouse, and he prepares his heart for whatever God will ask of him next. The storm is far from over. The kingdom's testing has barely begun. But here, in this hidden place, God's prophet grows strong for battles yet to come. The widow of Zarephath. The brook begins to fail. Day by day, the water level drops like hope in a drought-stricken land. The flow that once splashed cheerfully over rocks becomes a whisper, then a trickle, then damp spots on sun-baked stones. Even God's special provision has limits when heaven's judgment falls complete. Elijah watches the water disappear and waits for new instructions. He has learned not to panic when circumstances change. The God who sent ravens to feed him has not forgotten his promise. The silence before the next command holds its own kind of peace. The word comes clear as crystal. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow there to supply you with food. Sidon, Jezebel's homeland, enemy territory where Baal worship reaches its fullest flower. God is sending his prophet into the heart of pagan darkness to depend on a woman who has never heard of Abraham's God. The irony tastes bitter as wormwood. While Israel's wells run dry despite their covenant privileges, a Gentile widow will provide for God's prophet. The journey takes days across territory, growing more desperate with each mile. Refugees crowd the roads, carrying bundles of possessions and children too tired to walk. Dust covers everything like a gray shroud. The sun beats down merciless as a bronze hammer on the anvil of a dying land. Zarephath sits on the Mediterranean coast, a small town that lives by fishing and trade. But even here, far from Israel's borders, drought has left its mark. Gardens lie withered. Cisterns hold only bitter dregs. The sea provides some fish, but not enough to feed a population swollen with refugees from the dying interior. Elijah arrives at the town gate tired and thirsty. The sun stands high and hot overhead. Dust fills his mouth and burns his throat. He needs water. But more than that, he needs to find the widow God has promised. Among all the desperate people in this desperate place, one woman has been chosen to care for heaven's messenger. She appears like an answer to unspoken prayer. A thin woman gathering sticks near the gate, her movements slow with hunger and weariness. Her clothes speak of poverty that has deepened into desperation. This cannot be the woman God meant. Surely the Almighty would choose someone with abundance to share. But the Spirit whispers confirmation in Elijah's heart. This is the one. This widow with her bundle of twigs and her face marked by sorrow. God's ways continue to surprise even his most faithful servants. Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? Elijah calls to her. His voice sounds rough from days of dust and wind. The request seems simple, but water has become precious as gold in these days of drought. The woman looks up, and her eyes hold depths of sadness that seem familiar. She has buried her husband. She has watched her resources dwindle. She knows the taste of fear that comes when the last grain of wheat sits in an empty jar, yet something in the stranger's voice compels her to nod and turn toward her small house. As she walks away, Elijah calls after her, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." She stops as if struck by lightning. Slowly she turns back, and her voice carries the weight of coming death. "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words hang in the air like a funeral song. This woman stands at the very edge of existence. The meal she plans will be her last. After that, only starvation remains. Yet God has chosen her to feed his prophet. The divine logic continues to baffle human understanding. Elijah's heart fills with compassion and faith in equal measure. He has learned to trust God's promises even when they seem impossible, especially when they seem impossible. "Don't be afraid," he tells her, his voice gentle as rain on thirsty ground. "Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The woman stares at him as if seeing a vision. This stranger asks for her last morsel of food, then promises that her supplies will never run empty. In a world where drought has made liars of all-weather prophets, he speaks of miracles as if they happen every day. Something in his eyes convinces her. Perhaps it's the quiet authority in his voice. Perhaps it's desperation that makes any hope worth grasping. Perhaps it's the gentle touch of God on her heart, whispering that this strange man speaks truth beyond human understanding. She goes home and does exactly as Elijah asked. She makes a small loaf from her handful of flour and her few drops of oil. She brings it to the prophet who waits by her door. Then she returns to prepare the final meal for herself and her son. But the jar of flour is not empty. The jug of oil has not run dry. Where scarcity ruled moments before, abundance now flows like a hidden spring. The God of Israel has spoken, and his word never returns void. The son who died days flow into weeks in the widow's small house. The miracle of flour and oil continues without interruption. Each morning, the woman expects to find empty containers. Each morning, plenty remains. The God of Israel keeps his promises with clockwork precision. Elijah settles into the rhythm of this strange household. He sleeps in the upper room, grateful for shelter and the sound of normal life below. The widow's son plays in the courtyard, his laughter a sweet sound in a world grown harsh with drought. For the first time in months, the prophet experiences something like peace. The boy becomes curious about their guest. Who is this man with the wild eyes and gentle hands? Why does he spend so much time in prayer? What does he see when he stares into the sky as if reading letters written in clouds? The child's questions flow like water from a spring, innocent and endless. Elijah grows fond of the boy's quick mind and eager spirit. Here is life unmarked by cynicism or fear. Here is trust that accepts miracles as easily as sunshine. The prophet finds himself telling stories of his homeland, of the God who speaks through burning bushes and parts seas with a word. The woman watches their friendship with wonder. Her son has been sad since his father's death, quiet in ways that worried her heart. Now laughter returns to his voice. Hope brightens his eyes. The strange man from Israel has brought more than miraculous food to their house. He has brought joy back from the dead. But then comes the morning when the boy does not wake for breakfast. His mother calls his name with growing alarm. She shakes his small shoulders, but his body remains still as stone. His breath has stopped. His heart beats no more. Death has stolen into their house like a thief in the night. The woman's grief explodes into rage and accusation. She carries her dead child to Elijah's room and confronts him with eyes blazing like torches. What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? Her words cut deep because they voice the question that haunts every believer in times of inexplicable loss. Why does God allow suffering to touch the innocent? Why does death claim children while evil men live long lives? If the Almighty can multiply flour and oil, why couldn't he protect a boy from sickness? Elijah feels the weight of her pain as if it were his own. This woman has given him shelter when he had nowhere else to go. She has shared her last meal without complaint. She has trusted in Israel's God based on nothing but his word, and now her son lies dead in her arms. Give me your son, he says quietly. The command sounds harsh, but his voice carries infinite gentleness. The woman hesitates, then places her precious burden in the prophet's arms. The boy's body feels cold and small, like a bird fallen from its nest. Elijah carries the child to his own room and lays him on his bed. Then he begins to cry out to God with the desperation of a man whose faith hangs by a thread. Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die? The prayer continues with raw honesty that holds nothing back. This is not the polite petition of formal worship. This is the anguished cry of a heart being torn in two. The prophet who has seen miracles beyond counting now faces the one miracle he fears most to request. 3 times, Elijah stretches himself on the child's still form. 3 times he cries out for life to return. Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. The words echo off the walls like thunder in a closed room. Nothing happens. The boy remains still. Death keeps its grip with fingers of ice. But Elijah continues to pray, continues to hope, continues to believe that the God who creates life from nothing can restore it to a small body grown cold. Then, like dawn breaking after the longest night, warmth returns to the child's skin. A flutter stirs in his chest. His eyes open wide with surprise, as if he has awakened from the deepest sleep. Breath fills his lungs with a sound like wind through dry grass after rain finally comes. The boy sits up, looking around the room with confusion that quickly gives way to joy. He is alive. Completely, perfectly, miraculously alive. Death has been forced to release its prey. The impossible has become reality through the power of desperate prayer. Elijah lifts the boy in his arms and carries him down to his mother. Look, your son is alive. The words sound insufficient for the magnitude of the miracle, but they carry the weight of heaven's victory over hell's darkest weapon. The woman takes her son and holds him as if she will never let him go. Her tears flow like rivers, but now they taste of joy instead of sorrow. She looks at Elijah with eyes that have seen beyond the veil of ordinary existence. Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Her declaration carries the authority of one who has witnessed resurrection. She has moved beyond belief into knowledge, beyond hope into certainty. This is the first time in all of Scripture that someone returns from death to life. The precedent will echo through history until another son dies and rises again, this time to stay. But for now, in a small house in Sidon, heaven has shown its power over the grave. The widow feeds her son and marvels at the miracle of his appetite. Elijah watches them both and feels his own faith strengthened by what he has seen. The God who sends ravens and multiplies flour can also defeat death itself. No power in earth or hell can stand against such love. The third-year silence has settled over Israel like dust on an abandoned house. 3 years without rain, 3 years without dew, 3 years of watching the sky for clouds that never come. The land lies cracked and broken, painted in shades of brown and gray that speak of death and desperation. King Ahab has aged beyond his years. The drought has carved lines in his face deeper than a sword could cut. His kingdom staggers like a drunk man, weakening with each passing season. Cattle die in the fields, horses grow thin as skeletons. Even the palace wells run low, their water bitter with minerals drawn from desperate depths. Jezebel's prophets of Baal dance themselves to exhaustion, calling for rain. They cut their bodies until blood flows like the water they cannot bring. They shout until their voices crack like the parched earth, but the sky remains brass, and their God remains silent as stone. The people begin to whisper dangerous thoughts. Perhaps Baal is not as powerful as they believed. Perhaps the old God of their fathers still watches over Israel. Perhaps the wild prophet who announced this drought spoke truth after all. But whispers are dangerous things when queens have sharp ears and sharper swords. Famine stalks the land like a predator hunting wounded prey. The rich eat their stored grain, while the poor gather roots and weeds. Children cry themselves to sleep with empty bellies. Old people sit in doorways with eyes that have seen too much suffering. Death becomes a frequent visitor to homes that once knew plenty. Foreign merchants avoid Israel's borders. Who wants to trade with a kingdom where water costs more than wine? Caravans take longer routes through more hospitable lands. The economic isolation deepens the crisis, turning shortage into genuine starvation. Ahab sends his soldiers to search every cave and valley for the prophet who holds the key to their deliverance. They question travelers and refugees. They offer rewards for information. They threaten punishment for those who hide the truth. But Elijah remains hidden beyond human searching, protected by the same God who sends the drought. In the palace, counselors argue endlessly about solutions. Some suggest raiding neighboring kingdoms for their stored grain. Others propose moving the capital to a city with better water sources. A few brave souls whisper that perhaps they should seek the God of Israel, but their voices quickly grow quiet when Jezebel passes near. The queen herself shows no signs of doubt. She maintains her lavish lifestyle while her subjects starve. Her table groans with food brought from distant lands. Her gardens stay green through water hauled by slaves from secret springs. If the kingdom suffers, that only proves the people lack faith in Baal. Yet even Jezebel feels the pressure. Her husband grows more difficult each day, snapping at servants and brooding for hours without speaking. The other kings of the region watch Israel's weakness with eyes that calculate advantage. Enemies smell blood in the water like sharks sensing a wounded swimmer. Meanwhile, in Zarephath, Elijah continues his quiet exile. The widow's house has become an island of plenty in a sea of want. The flour never fails. The oil never runs dry. The boy grows strong and healthy while children throughout Israel waste away with hunger. But the prophet's heart aches for his homeland. He knows the suffering his words have brought. He feels the weight of every death, every tear, every empty stomach. The drought serves God's purpose, but its cost measures beyond human calculation. Justice and mercy war in his spirit like storm clouds gathering for battle. Prayer becomes his refuge in the long nights when sleep will not come. He speaks to God about the people's pain. He pleads for wisdom to know when the lesson has been learned. He asks for strength to endure the burden of being heaven's instrument of judgment. The God who speaks through whirlwinds and earthquakes often communicates through silence. Elijah learns to find meaning in the quiet spaces between words. The absence of immediate answers becomes its own kind of message. Wait. Trust. The timing belongs to heaven, not earth. Reports reach Zarephath through merchants and refugees. Israel grows weaker each month. Some of the people begin to turn back to the God of their fathers, offering desperate prayers for rain. But most still bow to Baal, believing their suffering comes from insufficient devotion to their new gods. The drought has accomplished part of its purpose. It has exposed the powerlessness of false gods. It has shown that carved wood and stone cannot command the forces of nature. But has it truly changed hearts? Has it driven Israel back to their first love? The answer remains unclear as morning mist. Then, on an ordinary day that seems no different from 1,000 others, the word of the Lord comes to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. The command falls like lightning into the stillness of his exile. 3 years of hiding end in a single moment. 3 years of preparation culminate in a new beginning. The drought will break, but not quietly, not without one final, decisive confrontation between the prophets of Baal and the God of Israel. Elijah rises from his knees and begins to pack. The widow watches with eyes that understand. Her son clings to the man who has become like a father to him. They all know this departure is different. This time, the prophet goes not to hide, but to reveal himself, not to wait, but to act. The final act of the drought drama is about to begin. The stage is set for a confrontation that will echo through the ages. On Mount Carmel, under the watching eyes of all Israel, fire will fall from heaven and rain will return to the earth. But first, Elijah must walk back into the kingdom that has wanted him dead for 3 long years. Obadiah and the hidden prophets. In the palace of King Ahab lives a man caught between 2 worlds. Obadiah serves as governor of the royal household, trusted with the daily operations of the kingdom. His name means servant of Yahweh, yet he works for a king who has abandoned the God of Israel. The contradiction weighs on his conscience like a stone in his chest. Few people know the secret that could cost Obadiah his life. While Jezebel's sword drinks the blood of God's prophets, while caves echo with the screams of faithful men, Obadiah has hidden 100 servants of the Lord in 2 groups of 50. He feeds them with bread and water stolen from the royal kitchens, risking everything to preserve a remnant of true worship in Israel. The operation requires careful planning and constant vigilance. Caves must be found that are deep enough to hide 50 men, but close enough for regular supply runs. Food must be diverted without arousing suspicion. Water must be carried in vessels that won't be missed. One careless moment, one suspicious guard, one whispered rumor could destroy everything. Obadiah moves through the palace like a man walking on thin ice. He attends meetings where Jezebel plans the destruction of God's prophets. He listens to reports about the search for Elijah. He nods at appropriate moments and keeps his face carefully neutral. But inside, his heart burns with the conflict between duty and faith. The hidden prophets know they owe their lives to this brave man. They pray for him daily, asking God to protect their protector. They understand the danger he faces every time he walks through the palace gates. One word from Jezebel would mean death, not just for them, but for the man who has shown them such costly kindness. The caves where they hide become underground schools of faith. Older prophets teach younger ones the songs of David. They recite the law of Moses from memory. They tell stories of Abraham's journey and Joshua's victories. In the darkness of their hiding places, the light of God's truth burns bright as stars in a midnight sky. Obadiah's faith grows stronger through the pressure of his circumstances. Each successful supply run deepens his trust in God's protection. Each narrow escape from discovery reinforces his belief that heaven watches over those who serve with pure hearts. He learns that courage is not the absence of fear, but faithfulness in spite of it. The drought makes his mission both harder and easier. Harder because food grows scarce throughout the kingdom. Every loaf of bread becomes precious as gold. Every jar of water is counted and measured. But easier too, because the general chaos provides cover for unusual activities. In desperate times, people notice less when supplies go missing. The royal household struggles like everyone else. Servants work harder for smaller rations. Guards grow irritable from hunger and thirst. Even the king's table offers less variety than before. Obadiah uses the confusion to his advantage, redirecting resources with the skill of a man whose life depends on careful planning. News reaches the palace regularly about the search for Elijah. Ahab has sent messengers to every neighboring kingdom, asking if they have seen the prophet who brought this curse upon Israel. Some kings swear oaths that they have not hidden the wanted man. Others simply refuse to help, enjoying Israel's distress too much to offer assistance. Obadiah knows more about Elijah than he dares reveal. The hidden prophets speak of him with reverence and hope. They share stories of his miracles, his courage, his uncompromising dedication to God's truth. To them, he represents everything they wish they could be. To Obadiah, he seems like a dangerous dream too good to believe. The strain of his double life shows in small ways. He sleeps poorly, always listening for footsteps in the corridor. He eats little, his stomach too knotted with worry to accept food. His hair grows gray at the temples, aged by stress beyond his years. Yet he continues his secret mission because stopping would mean watching good men die. Jezebel grows more suspicious as the drought continues. She questions her servants about missing supplies. She watches for signs of disloyalty among her staff. Her eyes seem to follow Obadiah whenever they cross paths in the palace halls. He forces himself to appear calm, while his heart races like a frightened bird. The queen has informants throughout the kingdom. Merchants, soldiers, even beggars report to her about unusual activities. The network of spies makes everyone paranoid. Neighbors watch neighbors. Servants suspect fellow servants. Trust becomes a luxury few can afford in such dangerous times. But God protects his faithful servant. Time after time, Obadiah escapes detection by margins so narrow they can only be called miraculous. Guards turn away at crucial moments. Meetings run late, providing cover for supply runs. Storms blow up suddenly, giving him excuses to seek shelter near the hidden caves. The 100 prophets pray constantly for their benefactor and their kingdom. They fast and weep and intercede for rain to return to the land. They cry out for justice against those who shed innocent blood. They plead for God to remember his covenant with Israel and restore his wandering people. Some nights, Obadiah lies awake and wonders how much longer this can continue. The hiding places grow more difficult to supply. The queen's suspicions deepen daily. The prophets themselves grow restless, wanting to emerge and declare God's truth openly. The pressure builds like water behind a dam that threatens to burst. Yet he perseveres because he has seen too much to quit now. He has watched ordinary men become heroes through their faith in impossible circumstances. He has witnessed the power of prayer to sustain life when all earthly resources fail. He has learned that God's strength shows most clearly through human weakness. The drought will end someday. Jezebel's reign will pass into history. But the memory of 100 prophets preserved by one faithful man will echo through generations. The God who notices sparrows falling from trees has not forgotten those who risk everything to serve his purposes. Morning comes to the palace like it has for 3 years now, without dew, without clouds, without hope of rain. But Obadiah rises and prepares for another day of dangerous faithfulness. The hidden prophets depend on him. God has called him to this work. And somewhere in the wilderness, Elijah still lives, key to Israel's deliverance, confronting the king. The road back to Samaria stretches long and dusty under the merciless sun. Elijah walks through a landscape transformed by 3 years without rain. Where green fields once waved in gentle breezes, cracked earth spreads like broken pottery. Where streams once bubbled with clear water, dry ravines hold only stones and bitter memories. The prophet's footsteps raise small clouds of dust with each step. His face, weathered by wind and sun, shows the marks of his long exile. But his eyes burn with purpose that has nothing to do with the fire overhead. The time for hiding has ended. The moment for confrontation has come. As he travels, he passes refugees fleeing toward other kingdoms. Families carry their possessions in bundles tied with rope. Children walk barefoot, their feet hardened by miles of rocky ground. Old people lean on sticks, their faces carved by suffering into masks of endurance. They look at the wild prophet with eyes that have forgotten how to hope. Some recognize him from stories whispered around dying campfires. Is this the man who brought the drought? The one who spoke judgment on Israel and then disappeared like morning mist? They watch him pass with expressions mixing fear and desperate curiosity. If he could bring the curse, perhaps he can lift it too. Meanwhile, in Samaria, King Ahab grows more desperate each day. The royal stables hold only a few horses, their ribs showing through dull coats. The palace gardens have become graveyards of withered plants. Even the fountains stand dry, their carved decorations mocking the water they can no longer provide. Ahab calls for Obadiah, his trusted household manager. The king's voice carries the weariness of a man who has borne too much for too long. Dark circles ring his eyes. His royal robes hang loose on a frame thinned by stress and poor eating. The crown seems too heavy for his graying head. Go through the land to all the springs and valleys, Ahab commands. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals. The request reveals how far the kingdom has fallen. The king of Israel now searches personally for grass to feed his livestock. Obadiah bows his acceptance of the mission, but his heart heavy with knowledge he cannot share. He knows where 100 prophets hide in caves, sustained by increasingly meager rations. He knows the drought continues because Israel has not truly repented. He knows that only God can end what God has begun. The two men decide to search in different directions to cover more ground. Ahab takes one route while Obadiah takes another. The irony cuts deep. The king, who has abandoned God, searches for natural solutions, while his faithful servant walks roads that might lead to divine answers. Obadiah has not gone far when he sees a figure approaching in the distance. The man's silhouette wavers in the heat like a mirage, but as he draws closer, recognition strikes like lightning. The wild hair, the weathered clothes, the unmistakable bearing of authority mixed with humility. This can only be Elijah. The household manager's first instinct is to run. Meeting the most wanted man in Israel on a lonely road seems like a trap designed by cruel fate. But something in the prophet's approach suggests purpose rather than accident. This is no chance encounter. This is divine appointment. Elijah stops a few paces away and speaks first. "Is that you, Obadiah?" His voice carries warmth that surprises the frightened official. No anger burns in his words. No accusation colors his tone. He speaks like a man greeting an old friend rather than confronting an enemy. Obadiah falls on his face in reverence and terror. "Yes, my lord. It is I." The words come out barely above a whisper. He cannot look directly at the man whose words have brought such judgment upon the land. Yet he cannot run from someone who clearly serves the God he loves. "Go tell your master, Elijah is here," the prophet commands. The instruction sounds simple, but both men understand its implications. Telling Ahab about this encounter will expose Obadiah to royal suspicion. Why was he talking to the kingdom's most wanted criminal? How did he recognize him so quickly? Obadiah's response reveals the depth of his fear. "What have I done wrong that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death?" His voice shakes like leaves in a storm. He knows Ahab's temper. He knows Jezebel's cruelty. Being associated with Elijah could mean execution for his entire family. The faithful servant continues his plea, revealing information that surprises even the prophet. "As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they were telling the truth." The scope of the search amazes even Elijah. Ahab has turned the hunt for one prophet into an international incident. Kings have been forced to swear oaths about their knowledge of his whereabouts. The drought has made finding Elijah a matter of urgent diplomatic necessity. But Obadiah is not finished. His next words reveal the secret he has guarded with his life. "I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my Lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water." The revelation strikes Elijah like a thunderbolt. While he is hidden safely in foreign lands, this man has risked everything to preserve God's servants in the heart of enemy territory. While the prophet has enjoyed miraculous provision, Obadiah has shared his own food with those who would otherwise starve. Understanding dawns in Elijah's eyes. He sees the courage it has taken for this man to live a double life for 3 long years. He recognizes the faith required to trust God in circumstances far more dangerous than his own exile. His voice softens with respect and gratitude. "As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today." The promise carries the weight of divine oath. Elijah will not disappear again. He will not leave Obadiah to face royal wrath alone. Today, the hiding ends and the confrontation begins. Obadiah nods and turns towards Samaria, carrying news that will shake the kingdom to its foundations. Behind him, Elijah prepares for the meeting that will determine Israel's future. The stage is set for the greatest spiritual battle in the nation's history. Fire from heaven. Mount Carmel rises above the surrounding hills like a green throne in a brown kingdom. Even in drought, its slopes hold more life than the dying plains below. Springs hidden in rocky clefts still offer water to those who know where to look. Trees that have deep roots continue to spread leafy shade. This mountain will serve as the perfect stage for heaven's theater. The word spreads through Israel like wildfire. Elijah has returned. The prophet who brought the drought now calls for a gathering on Carmel. All Israel must come. The prophets of Baal and Asherah must attend. King Ahab himself will witness what happens when false gods face the true God of Israel. They come from every corner of the dying kingdom. Farmers leave their withered fields, merchants close their empty shops, families pack meager supplies and join the streams of people flowing toward the sacred mountain. Some come hoping for rain. Others come expecting spectacle. All come knowing they will witness something that will change everything. Ahab arrives with the grandeur expected of royalty, though his procession looks shabby compared to former days. Horses pull his chariot, but their ribs show through dull coats. Soldiers march in formation, but their uniforms hang loose on frames thinned by poor rations. The crown still glitters on his head, but the man beneath it shows the marks of 3 years without rest. The prophets of Baal number 450 strong. They come dressed in their finest robes, carrying ceremonial knives and torches. Their confidence seems unshakable. This is their moment to prove their God's power. 3 years of drought have only increased their determination to call down fire and rain. Asherah's prophets add another 400 to the false army. They bring carved poles and golden ornaments, instruments of worship polished to mirror brightness. Their chants fill the air with exotic melodies that speak of foreign lands and alien gods. Together, the false prophets outnumber Elijah 850 to 1. But numbers mean nothing when heaven chooses to act. The lone prophet stands before the assembled multitude like David facing Goliath. His clothes speak of wilderness and wind. His hair flows wild and free. His eyes hold depths that make proud men look away. When he speaks, his voice carries across the mountainside like thunder before a storm. How long will you waver between two opinions? The question cuts through the crowd's murmur like a sword through silk. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. The challenge could not be clearer. No more compromise. No more hedging bets. Choose this day whom you will serve. The people remain silent as stones. They want rain, they want prosperity, they want peace, but they do not want to choose between competing gods. Choice requires commitment. Commitment demands sacrifice. Sacrifice costs more than most people want to pay. Elijah continues with patient authority. I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. His words acknowledge the odds while dismissing their importance. God plus one always equals a majority when that one stands in the center of heaven's will. The terms of the contest sound simple enough. 2 bulls will be prepared for sacrifice. 2 altars will be built. 2 groups of prophets will call on their gods to send fire from heaven. The God who answers with flame will prove himself the true deity of Israel. You call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. The crowd responds with approval. This makes sense to minds that understand demonstrations better than doctrine. Let the gods compete. Let heaven reveal which religion deserves their allegiance. The prophets of Baal choose their bull and prepare their altar with elaborate ceremony. They arrange the wood with perfect precision. They cut the meat into precise portions. They sprinkle sacred oils and mutter ritual blessings. Everything must be perfect for their God to respond. Then begins the strangest prayer meeting in human history. 450 prophets dance around their altar, calling on Baal with increasing desperation. Their voices rise in harmonized chanting that echoes off the mountain slopes. They leap and shout and wave their arms toward the cloudless sky. Morning passes into afternoon and still no fire falls. The sun beats down mercilessly on the sweating prophets. Their voices grow hoarse from calling. Their feet stumble from dancing. But they continue with the persistence of men whose lives depend on their God's response. Elijah watches their efforts with something approaching pity. These are sincere men serving a false God. Their dedication deserves respect, even if their theology needs correction. But sincerity cannot substitute for truth. Dedication cannot overcome delusion. At noon, the prophet of Israel begins to mock their efforts with gentle irony. Shout louder, surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. His words sting because they voice the doubts already growing in every watching heart. The false prophets respond by increasing their frenzy. They shout until their voices crack. They dance until they collapse from exhaustion. They cut themselves with knives and spears until blood flows like the rain they cannot produce. The mountain slope becomes a scene from nightmare as hundreds of men wound themselves in desperation. But the sky remains empty. No fire falls. No voice answers. No sign appears to encourage their efforts. Baal remains as silent as the carved stone he truly is. The afternoon wears on, and their God offers nothing but the echo of their own voices. Finally, as evening approaches, their strength fails completely. They stand around their altar like defeated soldiers after a lost battle. Blood stains their clothes, dust covers their faces. Despair weighs their shoulders down like heavy burdens. Their God has failed them utterly. Now Elijah steps forward to claim his turn. The crowd presses closer, sensing that something important is about to happen. The prophet works alone, needing no assistance for what comes next. He begins by repairing the altar of the Lord that stands broken nearby. 12 stones represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Each stone speaks of covenant promises that endure despite human faithlessness. Each piece tells a story of God's faithfulness through generations of wandering. The altar rises slowly, built by steady hands that have learned to trust in heaven's timing. The wood is arranged. The bull is prepared. Everything looks ready for a normal sacrifice. But then Elijah does something that makes the crowd gasp with amazement. He calls for 4 large jars to be filled with water and poured over the offering and the wood. Water. Precious, irreplaceable water in a land that has known drought for 3 years. The people watch in shock as their most valuable resource soaks into wood and meat. 3 times the prophet commands this shocking waste. 12 jars of water disappear into the altar until everything drips with the liquid they have craved for so long. The sacrifice becomes impossible by any natural means. Wet wood does not burn. Soaked meat does not ignite. The water pools around the altar in a trench dug for that purpose. If fire comes now, it must come from heaven. Then Elijah prays. Not with dancing or shouting or cutting, not with elaborate ceremony or religious theater. He simply speaks to God as a man speaks to his closest friend. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. The prayer lasts less than a minute. No repetition, no religious jargon, no manipulation, just honest conversation between heaven and earth. The prophet asks for fire not to prove his own power, but to demonstrate God's love for wayward Israel. Then it happens. Fire falls from heaven like lightning, but controlled and purposeful. It consumes the bull, the wood, the stones, and even the dust around the altar. It licks up the water in the trench as if it were oil. In seconds, nothing remains but empty ground where the altar stood. The people fall on their faces as one person. Terror and worship blend in their hearts like wine mixed with water. The cry rises from thousands of throats. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. The declaration echoes off the mountain slopes and rolls across the kingdom like thunder. Baal's prophets stand frozen in shock. Their God has been utterly defeated. Their theology lies in ruins. Their future stretches dark and uncertain. Some begin to run, but Elijah commands that none escape. Justice demands payment for years of leading Israel astray. The false prophets die by the sword beside the Kishon River. Their blood waters the ground that has known no rain for 3 years. It seems a harsh end, but the cancer of false religion requires radical surgery. Israel must be healed, whatever the cost. As the sun sets behind Mount Carmel, the people begin their journey home, with hearts transformed by what they have witnessed. They have seen the futility of false gods. They have experienced the power of the true God. Most importantly, they have learned that heaven still cares about the fate of wayward Israel. The fire has fallen. The prophets have been silenced. The choice has been made. Now only one thing remains. The rain must come to seal heaven's victory and restore the land that drought has claimed. A cloud like a man's hand. The altar stones still smoldered. Smoke drifted across Mount Carmel as the last flames died away. The people had witnessed something beyond their understanding. Fire from heaven. God's answer to Elijah's simple prayer. Now the prophet turned toward another miracle. 3 years without rain had left the land broken. Cracked earth stretched in every direction. Wells had run dry. Streams became dust. Animals wandered searching for water that no longer existed. The drought Elijah had declared was complete, but God had spoken. The time for rain had come. Elijah climbed higher up the mountain. His servant followed, footsteps echoing on the rocky path. They reached a place where they could see across the Mediterranean. Blue waters stretched to the horizon, calm and endless. Not a cloud anywhere. Go look toward the sea, Elijah told his servant. The young man shielded his eyes and gazed westward. Empty sky met empty water. Nothing stirred. There is nothing, the servant reported. Elijah knelt on the ground. He bent low, face between his knees, ancient posture of prayer, deep conversation with the Almighty. The prophet who had called down fire now asked for rain. 7 times Elijah sent his servant to look. 7 times the answer came back the same. Nothing. Clear skies, endless blue, no sign of change. The 8th time was different. The servant climbed to his watching spot. He scanned the horizon carefully. Far out over the water, something small caught his eye, barely visible. A tiny wisp of white against the blue. I see a small cloud, he called back, like a man's hand. Elijah lifted his head, one small cloud. Nothing more than a whisper of moisture, but the prophet knew what it meant. He jumped to his feet with sudden energy. Go quickly to Ahab, Elijah commanded. Tell him to get his chariot ready. Tell him to hurry down the mountain before the rain stops him. The servant ran toward the king's camp. Elijah watched that tiny cloud grow. What began as a wisp became a mass. What started small spread across the sky. Wind began to stir. The air changed. Moisture gathered. Within minutes, the small cloud had become many clouds. They rolled in from the sea, dark and heavy. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Lightning flickered. The smell of rain filled the air. King Ahab needed no second warning. He had seen the fire fall. He knew this prophet spoke for God. His horses were quickly hitched to the royal chariot. The king climbed aboard, reins in hand. The first drops began to fall. Large, warm drops that struck the dry ground with tiny puffs of dust. Then more drops. Faster. Heavier. The drought was ending. But something strange happened as Ahab raced down the mountain road. A figure appeared beside his chariot, running, keeping pace with the horses. It was Elijah. The prophet ran alongside the royal chariot as rain began to pour. His robes were tucked into his belt for easier movement. Water streamed down his face, lightning flashed overhead, thunder crashed around them. Ahab's horses were strong and fast. The chariot wheels spun over the muddy road. But Elijah matched their speed, step for step, mile after mile. The power of God strengthened the prophet's legs. They raced through the gathering storm. Rain fell harder with each passing minute. What had been a drought became a deluge. Water rushed down hillsides. Dry creek beds filled and overflowed. The land drank deeply after 3 years of thirst. Elijah ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. 18 miles of running in a thunderstorm. The prophet reached the city gates before the king's chariot, impossible human effort powered by divine strength. The rain continued through the night, steady, soaking rain that penetrated deep into the soil. Farmers would wake to find their fields beginning to turn green again. Wells would fill, springs would flow. The curse of drought was lifted, from one small cloud to a mighty storm, from 3 years of dryness to abundant rain. God's timing was perfect, his provision complete. What he promised, he delivered. Elijah had learned to recognize God's signs. A tiny cloud meant a great downpour was coming. Small beginnings often lead to mighty endings. Faith sees the storm in a wisp of vapor. The prophet who had hidden by a brook now ran through the rain. The man who had waited in silence now witnessed God's power in motion. Every step he took through the storm was a declaration of trust. Rain washed the dust from Mount Carmel. It filled the streams of Gilead. It turned the wilderness green. 3 years of drought ended in one afternoon of storm. God's word through his prophet had been fulfilled completely. In Jezreel, Elijah finally stopped running, exhausted but victorious. The rain fell around him like a blessing. The long, dry season was over. New life was beginning. Jezebel's threat rain still drummed on the palace roof in Jezreel. King Ahab sat in his chambers, water dripping from his clothes. The wild ride from Mount Carmel had left him shaken. Fire from heaven, rain from a clear sky. This prophet clearly spoke for a God more powerful than Baal. Ahab's wife found him there, staring at nothing. Queen Jezebel entered with her usual commanding presence. She noticed his troubled expression immediately. "What happened on the mountain?" she demanded. Ahab began the story slowly. The challenge: 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah, their frantic dancing and cutting, the silence from their gods, then Elijah's simple prayer and the fire that consumed everything. "All the prophets?" Jezebel's voice grew cold. "Every one," Ahab whispered. "The people killed them all by the brook. They said the Lord is God. They said it over and over." Jezebel's face hardened. Her carefully built religious system had collapsed in one afternoon. Years of work promoting Baal worship destroyed. Her imported prophets dead. Her influence challenged by one wilderness prophet. She called for a messenger immediately. "Find this Elijah," she commanded. "Tell him that by this time tomorrow, his life will be like the lives of my prophets. I swear it by my gods." The messenger rode through the storm to deliver the threat. He found Elijah still in Jezreel, resting after his miraculous run. The prophet listened as the queen's words were repeated. A death sentence. Clear and simple. Jezebel had power to carry out her threats. She commanded armies. She controlled courts. She had killed prophets before without hesitation. Something unexpected happened to Elijah. Fear crept into his heart. Not the healthy respect he had shown God's power, but raw human terror. The same man who had faced down hundreds of false prophets now trembled at one woman's anger. Perhaps it was exhaustion, the long years of tension, the dramatic confrontation, the supernatural run through the storm. His body and spirit were spent. When threats came, he had no strength left to stand firm. Elijah rose and began walking, not toward Jezebel's palace to confront her, not toward safety among the people who had just declared the Lord as God, away, into the wilderness, away from everything. His servant followed, confused by this sudden flight. They walked through the night, rain still falling. By morning they had covered many miles. The prophet who had outrun a chariot now fled like a common criminal. They reached Beersheba, far south in Judah. Here Elijah left his faithful servant behind. "Stay here," he said simply. No explanation. No plan for return. Just a man walking alone into emptiness. The wilderness stretched ahead, rocky hills and scattered thorns, a place where few people ventured, where silence ruled and solitude reigned. Elijah walked deeper into this desolation, carrying only his fears. He found a broom tree offering meager shade, not much shelter, but enough to stop his endless walking. The prophet collapsed beneath its thin branches, utterly spent. Everything felt wrong. The great victory on Carmel seemed meaningless now. Fire from heaven hadn't changed Jezebel's heart. Rain from God hadn't brought peace to the land. One threat had undone everything. "I have had enough, Lord," Elijah prayed. "Take my life. I am no better than my fathers." He had reached the end of himself. The bold prophet who had declared drought and called down fire now wanted only to die, under a scraggly tree in an empty wilderness, far from anyone who might care. Elijah lay down in the shade and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly to his exhausted body, but his rest would not be empty. God was not finished with his prophet yet. The same Lord who had fed him by ravens and sustained him through drought would not abandon him in despair. Help was coming, though Elijah could not see it. Grace was near, though he felt only darkness. In the silence of the wilderness, mercy was preparing to speak. The whisper at Horeb's sleep brought no peace to the exhausted prophet. Elijah lay beneath the broom tree, haunted by dreams of Jezebel's anger. His body ached from the long flight south. His spirit felt crushed by failure and fear. Then something touched his shoulder, gentle but firm, a hand shaking him awake. "Get up and eat," a voice said. Elijah opened his eyes. An angel stood beside him, face kind but serious. Near his head sat fresh bread, still warm from baking. A jar of water waited nearby, cool and clean. The prophet sat up slowly. Everything hurt. His legs trembled from the long journey. His throat felt dry as dust. But the smell of bread stirred his hunger. He ate quietly, grateful for the unexpected gift. When he finished, sleep took him again. Deep, dreamless rest under the desert sky. The angel waited patiently. A second time, the heavenly messenger touched his shoulder. "Get up and eat," came the same gentle command. "The journey is too great for you." More bread appeared, fresh water filled the jar. Elijah ate again, this time with growing strength. Food prepared by heaven tasted better than anything from earth. Each bite restored more than just his body. The angel's words puzzled him. What journey? Elijah had fled to this wilderness to die, not to travel further. But as strength returned, understanding grew. God had plans beyond despair. Elijah rose and began walking again, not aimlessly this time, but with purpose he could not yet name. His feet carried him toward the south and east, through wadies and over ridges, past ancient paths worn by countless travelers. 40 days he walked, 40 nights he traveled. The supernatural bread sustained him completely. No hunger weakened him, no thirst slowed his steps. Divine provision carried him through the empty places. His destination became clear as the landscape changed. Rocky peaks rose ahead, sacred ground where Moses had received the law. Mount Horeb, also called Sinai, the mountain of God. Elijah climbed the familiar paths. Here Moses had seen the burning bush. Here he had returned with tablets of stone. Here God had revealed his glory and spoken his name. If anywhere held answers for a troubled prophet, this was the place. He found a cave high on the mountainside, a hollow in the rock that offered shelter and solitude. Here he could wait. Here he could listen. Here perhaps God would explain why everything had gone wrong. As night fell, the word of the Lord came to him, not in grand vision or mighty voice, but as a simple question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet's answer poured out like a flood. All his frustration and confusion, all his sense of failure and fear. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty," he began. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." Everything he had worked for seemed lost. The people had witnessed miracles, but still followed other gods. Victory on Carmel had lasted only a day. He felt completely alone in his faithfulness. "Go out and stand on the mountain," God commanded. "I am about to pass by." Elijah stepped from the cave onto a rocky ledge. The night was calm and still. Stars shone clearly in the desert sky. Peace surrounded the mountain. Then the earth began to shake. Violent trembling that split rocks and sent stones tumbling. A great and powerful wind followed, bending trees and howling through the canyons. After the wind came fire, lighting the darkness with fierce intensity. But in none of these mighty displays was the Lord present. When the earthquake stopped, when the wind died down, when the fire faded, silence returned. Deep, complete quiet that seemed to hold its breath. In that silence came a gentle whisper, quiet as breathing, soft as a sigh. A still, small voice that spoke more clearly than any storm. Elijah knew this was God. Not in the dramatic signs he expected, but in the whisper that reached his heart. He pulled his cloak over his face and stepped to the mouth of the cave. The same question came again. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet gave the same answer. His complaints remained unchanged. His sense of isolation continued. But something was different now. The whisper had touched places the earthquake could not reach. God's response brought perspective to his despair. Elijah was not alone. 7,000 in Israel had never bowed to Baal, hidden faithful ones he had never seen. Quiet believers who still honored the true God. His work was not finished either. 3 tasks awaited him: kings to anoint, a successor to train, justice to set in motion. God's plans would continue, with or without Elijah's understanding. The whisper taught what the storm could not. God's greatest power often moves in silence. His mightiest works happen without fanfare. The still, small voice accomplishes more than earthquakes. Elijah left the cave changed, not by spectacle, but by whisper. Not by answers, but by presence. Sometimes the softest voice carries the strongest message. Elisha the farmer morning light touched the fields near Abel Mahola. 12 teams of oxen moved in formation across the fertile ground, each pair guided by a different man. The spring plowing had begun in earnest, preparing soil for another year's harvest. Elisha worked with the last team, his hands firm on the wooden plow. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the oxen strained against the heavy earth. This was good land, rich and dark. His family had farmed here for generations. The young man knew these fields like his own face, every slope and hollow where water gathered after rain, which sections yielded the best grain. Farming was in his blood, passed down from father to son like a sacred trust. His father, Shaphat, owned considerable property. 12 teams of oxen meant wealth in this agricultural society. Each team represented years of careful breeding and training. The family had prospered through hard work and wise planning. Elisha had grown up with dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his palms. He understood the rhythm of seasons, when to plant, when to harvest, how to read weather signs and soil conditions. The land spoke to him in a language learned from childhood. But on this particular morning, something would change everything. A figure appeared at the edge of the field, walking steadily toward the plowing teams. The workers noticed him first, pointing and whispering among themselves. Strangers were uncommon in this rural area. As the man drew closer, Elisha recognized him. Everyone in Israel knew this face. The wild hair and rough clothing marked him clearly. This was Elijah the Tishbite, the prophet who had called down fire from heaven. Elijah walked directly toward Elisha's team. His eyes held purpose and certainty. He carried something in his hand, a cloak worn from years of travel, the prophet's mantle, symbol of his calling and authority. Without a word, Elijah threw his cloak around Elisha's shoulders. The rough fabric settled over the young farmer like a new identity, heavy with meaning, weighted with destiny. Then, just as silently, Elijah turned and walked away. No explanation, no detailed instructions, just the cloak and the clear understanding of what it meant, a call to prophetic ministry, an invitation to leave everything behind. Elisha stood frozen for a moment. The oxen waited patiently, sensing their master's distraction. Around him, the other workers had stopped their plowing to stare. The moment felt suspended in time. The young farmer looked at his oxen, then at his fields, then at the retreating figure of Elijah. His old life and new calling pulled in different directions. The choice was his to make. "Wait," Elisha called after the prophet. He began running, the cloak flowing behind him. When he caught up with Elijah, his request was simple and reasonable. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, then I will come with you." Elijah's response seemed almost harsh. "Go back. What have I done to you?" But his tone suggested testing rather than rejection. He wanted to know the depth of Elisha's commitment. Elisha understood this was not about permission, but priority. The call to prophetic ministry demanded total dedication. Half-hearted followers would not survive the challenges ahead. The young man returned to his team, but not to resume plowing. Instead, he began unhitching the oxen. His fellow workers watched in amazement as he prepared for something dramatic. Elisha took the wooden plow and yoke and broke them into pieces. Seasoned wood that had served faithfully for years became kindling for a great fire. He slaughtered his team of oxen, using the wooden farming tools as fuel to cook the meat. The aroma drew people from surrounding fields and nearby houses. Word spread quickly that Shaphat's son was holding some kind of feast. Neighbors gathered, curious about this sudden celebration. Elisha distributed the roasted meat freely. Everyone ate their fill. It was more than a meal. It was a declaration. The young farmer was burning his bridges, making return to his old life impossible. When the feast ended and the fire burned low, Elisha walked away from everything he had known, the fields where he had worked, the family business he might have inherited, the comfortable, predictable life of a successful farmer. He followed Elijah into uncertainty. No guarantee of where they would sleep or what they would eat. No promise of safety or success. Just the call of God and the mentor who would teach him to hear the divine voice. Behind them, the ashes of Elisha's former life cooled in the evening air. Ahead lay adventures and trials he could not imagine. The farmer had become a prophet's apprentice. The cloak that Elijah had thrown now belonged to Elisha completely. Not just the physical garment, but everything it represented. Authority, responsibility, a life spent listening for God's whisper and speaking his words to a world that rarely wanted to hear them. From that day forward, Elisha served Elijah faithfully, learning, watching, preparing for the time when the master's cloak would pass to him permanently. Naboth's vineyard king Ahab strolled through his palace gardens in Samaria. Fruit trees heavy with ripening harvest lined the pathways. Carefully tended flower beds displayed their colors in neat rows. But the king's attention focused on something beyond his walls. Just next to the royal property grew a small vineyard. Ancient vines, well-established and productive. The location was perfect, close enough to become part of the palace grounds. Ahab had admired it many times during his walks. The vineyard belonged to a man named Naboth, a Jezreelite who had inherited the land from his ancestors. His family had tended these vines for generations. Each plant was like a child to him, nurtured with care and knowledge passed down through years. Ahab decided to make an offer. He approached Naboth with what seemed like reasonable terms. "Give me your vineyard," the king proposed. "I want to use it for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard elsewhere, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth in money." The offer was generous by most standards. Fair market value, or even better land in trade. Many people would have jumped at the chance to make such a deal with the king himself. But Naboth's answer came quickly and firmly. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." This was not about money or even better land. This vineyard represented something sacred, family heritage, generational blessing, the covenant relationship between God's people and the land he had given them. According to the law of Moses, family property was to remain within the clan. It could not be sold permanently to outsiders. Even if economic hardship forced a temporary sale, the land would return to the original family during the year of Jubilee. Naboth was not being stubborn or greedy. He was being faithful to God's commands and his family's trust. The vineyard was not his to sell, even to a king. Ahab returned to his palace angry and sullen. He had been refused, and his royal pride was wounded. The king who could command armies and build cities could not obtain one small vineyard from a common citizen. He threw himself on his bed and turned his face to the wall. Like a spoiled child denied a toy, Ahab refused to eat. His servants offered food, but he waved them away. The mighty ruler of Israel pouted over grapes. Queen Jezebel found him in this pathetic state. "Why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat?" Ahab explained his failed negotiation with Naboth, the vineyard so close to the palace, the reasonable offer, the stubborn refusal based on some old religious law. Jezebel listened with growing impatience. Her husband's weakness disgusted her. In her homeland of Sidon, kings took what they wanted without asking permission from peasants. "Is this how you act as king over Israel?" she demanded. "Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." While Ahab continued his sulking, Jezebel began planning. She wrote letters in the king's name and sealed them with his official seal. Her scheme was simple but deadly. The letters went to the elders and nobles in Naboth's city. Instructions for a public assembly, a fast day to seek God's guidance on some urgent matter. Naboth was to be given a seat of honor among the people. 2 worthless men were hired as false witnesses. They would publicly accuse Naboth of cursing both God and the king. Blasphemy and treason in one charge, crimes punishable by death under Jewish law. The plan worked perfectly. The assembly gathered. Naboth took his honored place, unsuspecting of the trap. At the appointed time, the false witnesses stood and made their accusations. "Naboth has cursed both God and the king," they declared. The crowd responded with shock and anger. Cursing God was the ultimate sacrilege. Cursing the king was treason. Both crimes deserved the harshest punishment. They dragged Naboth outside the city and stoned him to death. No trial, no defense allowed. Just mob justice based on lies. The innocent man died protecting his family's inheritance. News of Naboth's death reached Jezebel quickly. She went immediately to her husband with victory in her voice. "Get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite that he refused to sell you," she announced. "He is no longer alive, but dead." Ahab arose from his bed with sudden energy. His appetite returned. The sullen mood lifted. He dressed and walked directly to claim his prize. But as the king entered Naboth's vineyard, another figure appeared among the vines, tall and imposing, hair wild from the wilderness. The prophet Elijah stepped from the shadows like an avenging angel. "Have you found me, my enemy?" Ahab asked nervously. "I have found you," Elijah replied, "because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord." God's judgment fell like a hammer blow. Ahab's dynasty would be destroyed. Dogs would lick his blood in the same place where Naboth had died. Jezebel would meet an even worse fate. her body devoured by dogs outside Jezreel's walls. The vineyard Ahab had coveted would become a monument to divine justice. The grapes he had desired would be watered with tears of judgment. What seemed like royal victory became the beginning of royal doom. Naboth had died for his faithfulness, but his blood cried out from the ground for justice. And God, who sees every sparrow fall, had heard that cry. Chariots of Samaria. 3 years passed in relative quiet. No direct confrontation between Ahab and the prophet who had pronounced his doom. The king might have hoped that Elijah's words would fade with time, that divine judgment could be avoided through delay. But God's timing is not man's timing. Justice delayed is not justice denied. War clouds gathered on Israel's borders. Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, had recovered from his earlier defeats. His armies were strong again, ready to reclaim territory lost in previous battles. The target was clear: Ramoth-Gilead, a strategic city east of the Jordan River. King Jehoshaphat of Judah came north to visit his ally. The two kingdoms had maintained peace through careful diplomacy and royal marriages. Now Ahab saw an opportunity to strengthen their bond through shared military action. "Will you go with me to fight against Ramoth-Gilead?" Ahab asked his southern counterpart. Jehoshaphat's response was encouraging. "I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses." The alliance would hold. Two kingdoms would march together against their common enemy. But Jehoshaphat was a godly king who sought divine guidance before major decisions. "First, seek the counsel of the Lord," he requested. Ahab gathered his prophets, 400 men who claimed to speak for God but served the royal court more than heaven. Their message was unanimous and enthusiastic. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and be victorious," they declared. "The Lord will give it into the king's hand." Something about their unified optimism troubled Jehoshaphat. True prophets often disagreed with each other and challenged royal plans. These men seemed too eager to please. "Is there not a prophet of the Lord here whom we can inquire of?" he asked. Ahab's face darkened. "There is still one man through whom we can inquire of the Lord, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah." Reluctantly, Ahab sent for this unwelcome prophet. While they waited, the 400 court prophets continued their performance. One even made iron horns as visual aids, pushing and goring the air to demonstrate how Israel would defeat Syria. Micaiah arrived under guard, clearly no friend of the royal court. The messenger who had summoned him offered friendly advice. "Look, the other prophets are predicting success for the king. Let your word agree with theirs and speak favorably." But Micaiah's response revealed his integrity. "As surely as the Lord lives, I can tell him only what the Lord tells me." When brought before the two kings, Micaiah initially seemed to agree with the court prophets, but his sarcastic tone made his true opinion clear. Pressed to speak honestly, he delivered God's real message. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd, and the Lord said, 'These people have no master. Let each one go home in peace.'" The true prophet saw disaster ahead. Ahab would not return from this battle. His army would be defeated and scattered. The shepherd king would fall, leaving his flock defenseless. Ahab's anger flared. "Didn't I tell you that he never prophesies anything good about me, but only bad?" Micaiah continued with even more disturbing revelations. He had seen a vision of God's throne room, where a lying spirit was commissioned to deceive Ahab's prophets. The false encouragement the king had received was part of divine judgment. "Put this fellow in prison," Ahab commanded. "Give him nothing but bread and water until I return safely." Micaiah's parting words carried the weight of prophecy. "If you ever return safely, the Lord has not spoken through me." Despite the warning, both kings prepared for war. Their armies marched east toward Ramoth-Gilead, chariots and cavalry, infantry with spears and shields, a formidable force that should have been able to capture one contested city. But Ahab took precautions. Perhaps Micaiah's words had shaken his confidence. The king decided to disguise himself for battle, removing royal insignia and wearing common armor. Jehoshaphat would remain in his royal robes, easily identified as a king. The battle joined fiercely around Ramoth-Gilead's walls. Syrian and Israelite forces clashed with sword and spear. Chariots wheeled and charged, arrows filled the air like deadly rain. The Syrian king had given specific orders to his chariot commanders. "Do not fight with anyone, small or great, except the king of Israel." Ahab was the primary target. Kill him, and the battle would be won. When Syrian chariots spotted Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they assumed this was their quarry. They surrounded him completely, spears ready to strike the final blow. But when Jehoshaphat cried out, they realized their mistake. This was the wrong king. Meanwhile, Ahab's disguise seemed to be working. Hidden among common soldiers, he appeared safe from targeted attacks. The strategy might have succeeded, except for one arrow fired by one Syrian archer. The bowman was not aiming at anyone in particular, just drawing his bow and shooting into the mass of fighting men. Random warfare without specific targets. But God guides even arrows shot at random. The shaft found a gap in Ahab's armor. Between the sections of his breastplate, where joints allowed movement but created vulnerability, the point drove deep, finding flesh beneath the bronze and leather. Ahab knew immediately that the wound was mortal. Blood flowed freely, pooling in his chariot, but the battle still raged, and retreat would cause panic among his troops. "Take me out of the battle," he told his chariot driver. "I am wounded." They moved toward the rear of the fighting, but the king could not leave entirely. His presence was needed to maintain morale. So Ahab propped himself up in his chariot, blood steadily draining away, watching his army fight. All day the battle continued. All day Ahab grew weaker. As evening approached, the king of Israel died. The shepherd had fallen, just as Micaiah had prophesied. Word spread quickly through the ranks. Every man to his town, every man to his country. The army scattered like sheep without a shepherd. They brought Ahab's body back to Samaria for burial. Royal honors for a king who had sold his soul for a vineyard. When they washed his chariot at the pool of Samaria, dogs came to lick the blood, the same place where Naboth's blood had cried out for justice. Elijah's prophecy was fulfilled to the letter. Divine justice had found its mark as surely as that random arrow. Ahaziah's fall. The palace in Samaria felt empty without King Ahab's commanding presence. His son Ahaziah now sat on Israel's throne, but the crown weighed heavily on young shoulders. The new king lacked his father's political skills and military experience. Ahaziah had inherited more than just royal authority. He had also received his parents' devotion to foreign gods. Baal worship continued under his reign, encouraged by Queen Mother Jezebel, who still wielded considerable influence in court. The kingdom faced immediate challenges. Moab, long held as a tribute-paying vassal, sensed weakness in the transition of power. They rebelled against Israelite control, cutting off a significant source of royal income. Other neighbors watched carefully for signs of further instability. But domestic troubles would prove more dangerous than foreign enemies. The upper chambers of the royal palace in Samaria were built for comfort and privacy. Large windows allowed cooling breezes during hot summers. Decorative lattice work provided beauty while maintaining airflow through the rooms. Ahaziah was walking through his upper chamber one day when disaster struck without warning. Perhaps he leaned too heavily against a window. Maybe the lattice work had weakened over time. Whatever the cause, the decorative barrier gave way. The king fell through the broken lattice to the stone floor below. The impact was severe, crushing bones and causing internal injuries. Servants rushed to help, but the damage was clearly serious. Ahaziah's life hung in the balance. As he lay in pain, unable to move without agony, the young king's thoughts turned to spiritual matters. Who could heal such injuries? Which God had power over life and death? Rather than seeking the Lord God of Israel, Ahaziah chose to follow his family's religious preferences. He would consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. This Philistine deity was famous for giving oracles about health and recovery. "Go and consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron," Ahaziah told his messengers. "Ask whether I will recover from this injury." The mission seemed simple enough. Travel to the Philistine city of Ekron. Present the king's question to the priests of Baal-zebub. Return with whatever answer the god provided. Royal messengers had carried out similar diplomatic and religious errands many times before. But this particular journey would not proceed as planned. The messengers set out from Samaria, traveling southwest toward Philistine territory. The road was well-traveled, used by merchants and diplomats conducting business between nations. They expected no difficulties reaching their destination. However, as they walked along the highway, a figure appeared ahead of them. Tall and imposing, with wild hair and rough clothing, the unmistakable appearance of a wilderness prophet. This was Elijah the Tishbite. The prophets stepped directly into their path, blocking further progress toward Ekron. His presence commanded immediate attention. Even royal messengers knew better than to ignore this man. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Elijah demanded. The question struck at the heart of Israel's spiritual crisis. The nation that had witnessed fire from heaven was now sending messengers to consult foreign gods. The people who had seen rain return after 3 years of drought were seeking answers from Philistine idols. Elijah's message for King Ahaziah was direct and final. This is what the Lord says: you will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. The messengers stood frozen. They had been given a divine oracle, but not from the source they had intended to consult. Should they continue to Ekron? Should they return immediately to the king? The prophet's authority was undeniable. Without another word, Elijah turned and walked away. The messengers watched him disappear into the distance, then looked at each other uncertainly. Their mission had been interrupted by God himself. They decided to return to Samaria immediately. The journey back seemed longer than the trip out. How would they explain this encounter to their injured king? How would Ahaziah receive such unwelcome news? When they appeared before the king's bed much sooner than expected, Ahaziah was surprised. "Why have you come back so soon?" The messengers reported their strange encounter faithfully. A man had stopped them on the road. He claimed to speak for the Lord God of Israel. His message was clear and ominous. The king would not recover from his injuries. "What kind of man was it who came to meet you and told you this?" Ahaziah asked. Their description was precise. He had a garment of hair and had a leather belt around his waist. Recognition dawned immediately. Ahaziah knew exactly who had intercepted his messengers. That was Elijah the Tishbite, the same prophet who had troubled his father throughout his reign. The man who had called down fire from heaven and brought rain after drought. The voice of judgment who had pronounced doom on the house of Ahab. Fear and anger warred in the young king's heart. Part of him trembled at Elijah's words, knowing the prophet's track record for accuracy. But royal pride demanded action. No wilderness preacher would dictate terms to the king of Israel. Ahaziah decided on a show of force. If Elijah wanted to challenge royal authority, he would face the consequences. The king called for his military commanders. "Send a captain with 50 men to arrest this prophet," he ordered. "Bring Elijah here to face judgment for his interference." The company of soldiers set out from Samaria with confidence. 50 armed men should be more than enough to capture one desert wanderer. Their captain was experienced in military operations. This assignment seemed routine. They found Elijah sitting on top of a hill, calm and untroubled by their approach. The prophet showed no fear as the soldiers surrounded his position. He watched their deployment with the patience of a man who knew exactly what would happen next. The captain climbed partway up the hill and called out his demand. "Man of God, the king says, 'Come down.'" Elijah's response was simple and devastating. "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Fire fell immediately. Not gradual heat that allowed escape, but sudden, overwhelming flame that consumed all 51 soldiers in an instant. The hill where they had stood became blackened ground. Silence returned to the wilderness. Word of this disaster reached King Ahaziah quickly. 50 experienced soldiers, gone in a moment. The prophet remained free and unharmed. Royal authority had been challenged and found wanting. But Ahaziah's anger only increased. Perhaps the first captain had been too arrogant in his approach. Maybe a different tone would produce better results. The king sent another 50 men with a new commander. This second captain tried a more respectful approach. "Man of God, this is what the king says. Come down at once." Elijah's answer remained the same. "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Again, fire fell from heaven. Again, 51 soldiers perished in an instant. The hillside bore fresh scorch marks as evidence of divine power. 2 companies of Israel's army had been destroyed by the same prophet they had come to arrest. Back in Samaria, the king received news of the second disaster with growing desperation. 102 men dead. His military strength diminished, his authority openly mocked by forces beyond his control. Still, Ahaziah persisted. Pride would not let him admit defeat. A third captain received orders to capture Elijah, despite the obvious danger of the assignment. But this third commander was wiser than his predecessors. When he reached the hill where Elijah waited, he approached with humility instead of arrogance. Climbing up toward the prophet, he fell on his knees. "Man of God," he pleaded, "please have respect for my life and the lives of these 50 men, your servants. See, fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the first 2 captains and all their men. But now have respect for my life." His appeal recognized Elijah's authority and power. No demands, no royal threats, just a humble request for mercy from a man who clearly spoke for the Almighty. The angel of the Lord spoke to Elijah privately. "Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him." For the first time, the prophet descended from his hill. He walked peacefully among the soldiers, no longer their prisoner, but their guide. They formed an escort of honor rather than a capture party. When they reached the palace, Elijah was brought directly to King Ahaziah's bedside. The injured monarch lay propped up on pillows, pale from loss of blood and weak from his injuries. Face to face, the prophet delivered the same message his messengers had carried earlier. But now the words came with additional weight, spoken directly by the man who had just called down fire from heaven twice in one day. "This is what the Lord says. Is it because there is no God in Israel for you to consult that you have sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Because you have done this, you will never leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die." The prophecy was fulfilled exactly as spoken. King Ahaziah never recovered from his fall through the lattice. He died in that bed after reigning over Israel for only 2 years. Since Ahaziah had no sons, his brother Joram succeeded him on the throne. The house of Ahab continued, but under the shadow of divine judgment that would eventually consume the entire dynasty. The God of Israel had proven once again that he alone held power over life and death. Foreign gods offered no real help in times of crisis. Only the Lord could heal, and only the Lord determined when healing would come. Fire from heaven. Again, King Ahaziah died exactly as Elijah had prophesied. His brother Joram inherited the throne of Israel, along with all the unresolved tensions surrounding the troublesome prophet from Gilead. The new king had witnessed his brother's fate and knew the power Elijah wielded. But political pressure demanded action. The royal court buzzed with whispered conversations about the prophet's continued freedom. Military commanders complained that their authority had been undermined. How could the kingdom maintain order if wilderness preachers could kill soldiers with impunity? Some advisors urged caution. They had seen what happened to the previous king's messengers. Fire from heaven was not something earthly armies could defeat. Perhaps it would be wiser to leave Elijah alone. Others argued for stronger measures. The prophet's interference in royal affairs could not continue unchallenged. If one man could defy the king without consequences, others might follow his example. Royal authority itself was at stake. Joram found himself caught between competing pressures. Part of him feared the prophet's power, but another part felt the need to assert royal prerogatives. The decision of how to handle Elijah would define his early reign. The new king chose to test the prophet's resolve one more time. Perhaps Ahaziah's death had satisfied divine justice. Maybe circumstances had changed enough to allow a different outcome. Another military expedition was ordered, but this time the approach would be different. Instead of single companies, a larger force would be sent. Instead of demanding surrender, they would attempt actual capture. Overwhelming numbers might succeed where smaller groups had failed. A captain of 50 received his orders with considerable reluctance. He had heard the stories about burning hillsides and vanishing soldiers. This was not an assignment any sane commander would want, but royal commands could not be refused. The company marched out from Samaria with heavy hearts, 50 good men walking toward what might be their destruction. They traveled slowly, each mile bringing them closer to a confrontation none of them desired. They found Elijah in his usual place, sitting calmly on a hill overlooking the surrounding countryside. The prophet appeared completely relaxed, as if he had been expecting their arrival. No fear showed in his weathered face. The captain approached with official formality, but little enthusiasm. His words carried the weight of royal authority, but his tone suggested personal reluctance. "Man of God," he called out, "the king says, 'Come down.'" The same demand that had cost two previous captains their lives, the same challenge to divine authority that had resulted in fire from heaven. But perhaps this time would be different. Elijah's response was identical to his previous answers. No variation in the words, no change in the tone, divine consistency in the face of repeated human stubbornness. "If I am a man of God," the prophet declared, "may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Fire fell immediately, intense heat that left no time for escape or final words. The third company of soldiers disappeared in flames, just like their predecessors. The hillside bore fresh scorch marks as evidence of God's unchanging power. King Joram received the news in his palace with growing desperation. 3 companies destroyed, 153 soldiers dead. The kingdom's military strength was being steadily eroded by one man's prayers. But the young king was not ready to surrender. Royal pride and political necessity demanded continued action. Perhaps a different approach would yield better results. Maybe larger numbers would overwhelm even divine intervention. Orders went out for a 4th expedition. This time, an entire company would be sent, but with different instructions. Instead of demanding immediate surrender, they would attempt to surround and capture the prophet through superior tactics. The new captain was chosen for his reputation and experience. If anyone could succeed where others had failed, this man might be the one. He studied the previous failures carefully, looking for lessons that might prevent another disaster. When his men were assembled and equipped, the captain addressed them honestly about their mission's dangers. They all knew what had happened to the previous expeditions. This assignment might cost them their lives. But military discipline held. Orders were orders, regardless of personal feelings. The soldiers would do their duty, even if that duty led to destruction. They marched out of Samaria with grim determination. Once again, they found Elijah on his hill, serene and undisturbed by their approach. The prophet seemed almost bored with these repeated confrontations. How many times would earthly kings test heavenly power? But as the 4th captain climbed toward Elijah's position, something different happened. Instead of shouting demands from a distance, he came close enough for quiet conversation. Instead of standing proudly, he fell to his knees. "Man of God," he said humbly, "please have respect for my life and the lives of these 50 men, your servants." This was not the voice of royal authority making demands. This was a frightened man pleading for mercy. The captain continued with obvious sincerity. "See, fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the first 2 captains and all their men, but now have respect for my life." The change in approach was dramatic. Recognition of Elijah's power, acknowledgement of previous disasters, a humble request for grace instead of an arrogant demand for submission. Something shifted in the spiritual atmosphere. The angel of the Lord spoke to Elijah with new instructions. This captain's humility had opened a door that arrogance had kept closed. "Go down with him," the angel commanded. "Do not be afraid of him." For the first time since this confrontation began, Elijah rose from his place on the hill. He walked peacefully down toward the waiting soldiers, no longer their target, but their escort. The soldiers formed a respectful guard around the prophet. They were no longer attempting capture, but providing protection. The humble approach had transformed enemies into servants. The procession moved toward Samaria at a measured pace. No urgency drove them now. The crisis had passed through one man's willingness to acknowledge divine authority and appeal for mercy. When they reached the palace, Elijah was brought directly before King Joram. The young monarch waited nervously, unsure what to expect from this legendary figure who had caused so much trouble for his family. The prophet's message was brief and pointed. The same truth he had delivered to the previous king, but now spoken to a living audience who could still choose how to respond. "This is what the Lord says," Elijah declared. "Is it because there is no God in Israel for you to consult that you have sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron?" The question challenged the fundamental assumptions of royal policy. Why seek foreign gods when the true God of Israel was available? Why trust Philistine idols when the creator of heaven and earth offered his guidance? But this time, there was no immediate pronouncement of death. Joram still had opportunity to choose a different path. The fire from heaven had been a warning, not a final judgment. Whether the young king would learn from his brother's fate remained to be seen. The prophet had delivered his message. The choice belonged to earthly rulers who would face the consequences of their decisions. Elijah left the palace as peacefully as he had entered. The soldiers who had come to arrest him now formed an honor guard for his departure. Humility had accomplished what force could never achieve. The final journey begins. Years had passed since the dramatic confrontations with fire from heaven. Elijah had grown older, his hair whiter, his step perhaps a little slower. But his spiritual vision remained sharp, and he knew his time on earth was drawing to a close. Beside him walked Elisha, no longer the young farmer who had burned his plows to follow a prophet. Years of training had transformed him into a seasoned man of God, ready to carry on the prophetic tradition. The student had become a successor. Their relationship had deepened through shared trials and quiet moments. Elisha had watched his master call down fire, raise the dead, and speak truth to kings. He had learned not just the dramatic acts of prophecy, but the daily discipline of listening for God's voice. On this particular morning, both men sensed something different in the air. A finality that had not been present before. Divine appointment written in the wind. Today would be unlike any other day they had shared. "Stay here," Elijah told his companion as they prepared to leave Gilgal. "The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha had no intention of being left behind. Not today, when everything felt charged with eternal significance. He had followed his master too long to abandon him now. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live," Elisha replied, "I will not leave you." The oath was binding and absolute. No force would separate them on this final journey. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. They walked from Gilgal toward Bethel, the ancient city where Jacob had dreamed of angels ascending and descending a heavenly ladder. Sacred ground where God had confirmed his covenant promises to the patriarch, a fitting stop on a prophetic pilgrimage. As they approached Bethel, a group of prophets came out to meet them. These were not the false prophets of royal courts, but genuine men of God who had recognized the spiritual significance of this day. The company of prophets drew Elisha aside for a whispered conversation. "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Their words confirmed what Elisha already sensed. This was Elijah's final day on earth. The great prophet would soon be removed from Israel, leaving a void that seemed impossible to fill. "Yes, I know," Elisha replied quietly. "So be quiet." He did not want to discuss the approaching separation. Some truths were too sacred for casual conversation. Better to spend these final hours in companionship than in endless speculation about divine plans. When the conversation with the prophets ended, Elijah again tried to send his companion away. "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." But Elisha's determination had not wavered. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." They continued together toward Jericho, the ancient city near the Jordan River. Here Joshua had led Israel into the Promised Land. Here walls had fallen at the sound of trumpets. Another place heavy with memories of God's power. At Jericho, the same scene repeated. Prophets approached Elisha with the same whispered question. "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Again, Elisha confirmed his knowledge and requested silence. He understood what was coming. Discussion would not change anything. Better to treasure these final moments than to spend them in unnecessary words. Once more, Elijah attempted to leave his student behind. "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And once more, Elisha refused to be separated. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." The pattern revealed both men's characters. Elijah, considerate of his companion's grief, trying to spare him the pain of final separation. Elisha, loyal beyond measure, unwilling to abandon his master in his hour of departure. 50 prophets from Jericho followed them at a distance. They sensed the historic nature of this moment. Something unprecedented was about to occur. They positioned themselves where they could witness whatever miracle awaited. The small procession moved toward the Jordan River, the same waters that had parted for Joshua centuries earlier. The boundary between wilderness wandering and promised possession. Here, the final act of Elijah's earthly ministry would unfold. Both master and student understood that their years together were ending. The teacher who had called fire from heaven would soon ascend to heaven himself. The student who had left everything to follow would soon stand alone. But God's plans were larger than human emotion. The prophetic tradition would continue. Divine purposes would be fulfilled. What seemed like an ending was actually a new beginning. As they approached the Jordan's banks, the river flowed steady and deep before them. No supernatural parting had occurred yet. The water remained an obstacle to their progress. But Elijah carried the cloak that had called Elisha from his plowing. The same mantle that had covered the young farmer now rested on shoulders that had borne the weight of Israel's spiritual crisis for decades. The final miracle of Elijah's ministry was about to begin. The Jordan would part one more time. But this crossing would be different from all the others. This time, only one man would return. Crossing the Jordan. The Jordan River flowed before them, its waters brown and swift from recent rains upstream. Spring currents carried debris from distant mountains, branches and mud swirling toward the Dead Sea. The crossing looked impossible for two men on foot. Elijah stood on the riverbank and removed his cloak. The rough woolen garment that had sheltered him through years of wilderness wandering, the mantle that marked him as God's prophet. Fabric worn thin by weather and time, but still carrying divine authority. He rolled the cloak tightly and raised it above his head. Then, with the same confidence he had shown before kings and false prophets, Elijah struck the water. The Jordan responded immediately. Waters that had been flowing south suddenly divided, piling up on either side of their path. The riverbed lay bare before them, muddy but passable. Stones and scattered fish marked the river's retreat. Elijah stepped onto the exposed ground without hesitation. His feet found firm footing where moments before rushing water had made crossing impossible. Behind him, Elisha followed with wonder written on his face. The 50 prophets watching from Jericho gasped at the miracle. They had heard stories of Moses parting the Red Sea, that of Joshua crossing this same river with all Israel. But to witness such power exercised by one man's faith was overwhelming. Master and student walked across on dry ground. The walls of water held steady on both sides, clear testimony to divine intervention. No natural explanation could account for what they were seeing. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the riverbed. Above them, fish swam in vertical walls of suspended water. Below them, river stones crunched under their sandals. They walked between two worlds, suspended between earth and heaven. As they reached the far bank, the waters flowed together again behind them. The Jordan resumed its normal course as if nothing had happened. Only the wet stones under their feet proved that a miracle had occurred. They climbed up from the riverbed to higher ground on the eastern side. Here the wilderness began in earnest. Rocky hills and scattered vegetation, a place of solitude where heaven and earth seemed to meet. Elijah turned to face his companion. Years of traveling together had led to this moment. The master's earthly ministry was complete. Time had come to pass the prophetic mantle to younger hands. "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elijah asked. The question hung in the desert air like a sacred invitation. One final gift from teacher to student. Whatever Elisha requested, if within divine will, light would be granted before their separation. Elisha's answer revealed the depth of his calling and the magnitude of his faith. He did not ask for wealth or long life or political power. His request focused entirely on spiritual authority. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he said. In Hebrew inheritance law, the firstborn son received a double portion of his father's estate. Elisha was asking to be recognized as Elijah's spiritual heir. He wanted to carry on the prophetic ministry with even greater power than his master had wielded. The request was both humble and audacious. Humble because it acknowledged Elijah's superior position as master and mentor. Audacious because it asked for supernatural endowment beyond human ability to grant. Elijah's response showed both affection and realism. "You have asked a difficult thing. Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." The condition was clear. If Elisha witnessed his master's departure, the double portion would be granted. If not, the request would remain unfulfilled. Divine sovereignty would determine the outcome. They continued walking together through the wilderness. Conversation became unnecessary. Both men understood what lay ahead. They had said everything that needed saying. Now they waited for God's timing. The landscape around them seemed charged with expectation. Every stone and shrub appeared to be holding its breath. Creation itself sensed that something unprecedented was about to occur. Behind them, the Jordan flowed normally again. Ahead of them lay territory that few prophets had explored. They walked toward a horizon that would soon reveal sights no human eye had ever seen. Elisha stayed close to his master, remembering the condition that had been set. He must see whatever happened next, or lose the spiritual inheritance he had requested. His eyes remained fixed on Elijah. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky. Heat began to shimmer off the rocks. But neither man paid attention to normal discomforts. They were walking toward eternity, and earthly concerns had lost their importance. Soon the moment would arrive. Heaven would reach down to claim its servant. Earth would lose one of its greatest prophets, and Elisha would discover whether his faith was strong enough to witness divine intervention firsthand. The final miracle was approaching. The most extraordinary departure in human history was about to begin. Two men walked together toward a destiny that would change both their lives forever. The fiery departure. The morning air hung still over the Jordan Valley. Elijah walked beside his faithful friend, their sandals crunching softly on the dusty path. Both men knew this day would be different. Something sacred stirred in the atmosphere around them. Elisha stayed close. His teacher had tried 3 times to leave him behind, but love holds tight when letting go feels impossible. The younger prophet sensed what was coming. Heaven itself seemed to whisper secrets in the breeze. They reached the river's edge where reeds swayed gently in the current. Elijah took his cloak, that same rough garment that had sheltered him through years of desert wandering. He rolled it carefully, his weathered hands moving with purpose. The water before them flowed wide and deep. No bridge crossed here. No shallow place offered easy passage. But Elijah raised his cloak high above his head and brought it down hard against the surface. The river split apart. Water piled up like walls on either side, leaving dry ground between. The same God who had opened seas for Moses now carved a path for his prophet. Elijah stepped forward without fear. Elisha followed close behind. Their feet touched riverbed stones that had been hidden under rushing water moments before. Fish flopped in shallow pools. Mud squelched beneath their sandals. The sound of held-back water surrounded them like distant thunder. On the far side, they climbed up the bank. Elisha brushed dirt from his robe. Elijah gazed back at the Jordan, now flowing normally again. The miracle had been quiet. Simple. No crowd watched. No trumpets sounded. They walked together through scrub brush and scattered stones. The sun climbed higher. Heat shimmered off distant hills. But Elijah's step grew lighter with each pace, as if invisible wings were already lifting him. "Ask what you want before I'm taken from you," Elijah said suddenly. His voice carried both sadness and hope, a teacher's final gift to his student. Elisha didn't hesitate. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." The words came from his heart, not his head. He wasn't asking for fame or power. He wanted to serve God with the same passion that burned in his master. Elijah smiled. "You've asked for something difficult, but if you see me when I'm taken, you'll receive it." They kept walking. The land stretched empty around them. No trees offered shade. No buildings broke the horizon. Just 2 men sharing their last moments together on earth. Then it happened. A sound like rushing wind filled the air, but no grass bent, no dust swirled. The noise came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond the physical world. Horses appeared first. Not earthly animals, but beings made of fire and light. Their manes flickered like flames. Their hooves sparked against invisible ground. Behind them rolled a chariot that blazed brighter than the sun. Elisha fell to his knees. His eyes widened in wonder and terror. The horses reared, their fiery forms dancing against the blue sky. The chariot wheels spun with supernatural speed. A whirlwind began to form. Not the destructive kind that levels crops and topples houses. This tornado carried the breath of heaven itself. It descended slowly, purposefully, wrapping around Elijah like a gentle embrace. The old prophet looked back one last time. His eyes met Elisha's. Love passed between them. Gratitude. The bond between teacher and student that death cannot break. Then the whirlwind lifted him. His feet left the ground. His cloak fluttered in the supernatural wind. Higher and higher he rose, surrounded by fire horses and celestial light. "My father! My father!" Elisha cried out. "The chariots and horsemen of Israel." His voice cracked with grief and awe. The man who had been like a father to him was disappearing into glory. The whirlwind spun faster. Elijah's form grew smaller. The horses galloped upward, pulling their blazing chariot toward realms beyond human sight. The sound of their hooves echoed like distant drums. And then silence. The whirlwind vanished. The horses disappeared. The chariot melted back into mystery. Elijah was gone, taken up without tasting death. Only the memory of fire remained, burned forever into Elisha's heart. Something fell from the empty sky above. Elijah's cloak drifted down like a gentle bird, landing softly on the ground between scattered rocks. The rough fabric held no trace of supernatural fire, yet it carried all of Elijah's authority. Elisha picked it up with trembling hands. The cloak felt ordinary, just wool and thread worn smooth by years of use. But he understood. This simple garment now held the power of God. His prayer had been answered. The double portion was his. He looked up one last time, searching the blue expanse for any trace of his master. Nothing remained but peaceful sky and drifting clouds. Elijah had crossed into eternity, this deck, leaving behind only questions, memories, and the sacred responsibility now resting on Elisha's shoulders. The young prophet stood alone in the wilderness, holding his inheritance, a cloak that had once belonged to the greatest prophet Israel had ever known. The weight of it pressed into his palms, not heavy with fabric, but dense with calling. Around him, the world continued unchanged. Bees hummed in wild flowers, lizards darted between stones. The Jordan flowed peacefully in the distance, the same river that had parted twice in one day to honor God's servants. But everything was different now. Elisha was no longer the student following behind. He was the prophet, the one to whom people would come with their troubles and their desperate prayers, the bridge between heaven and a hurting world. He folded the cloak carefully and tucked it under his arm. Time to return across the river. Time to begin his own journey as God's chosen messenger. The fire horses were gone, but their hoofprints remained invisible in his memory, reminding him that heaven was always closer than it seemed. Elisha strikes the water. The walk back to the Jordan felt longer than before. Each step carried Elisha away from the place where heaven had touched earth. His teacher was gone. The supernatural fire had faded. Only dusty ground and ordinary sky remained, but the cloak under his arm whispered of possibilities. This simple piece of cloth had parted waters once before. Would it do so again? Elisha wondered if God's power truly rested in the fabric, or if faith itself opened impossible doors. The river came into view, flowing peacefully between its banks. Cattails swayed in the shallows. Water bugs skated across the surface in lazy circles. Everything looked normal, almost mundane after witnessing chariots of fire. Elisha stood at the water's edge, where he and Elijah had crossed together just hours earlier. No trace remained of their miracle. The Jordan had swallowed the evidence, keeping its secrets beneath the current. He unfolded the cloak slowly. The fabric felt rough against his palms, worn thin in places, mended here and there with careful stitches. Nothing about it suggested divine power. It looked like any poor man's garment, unremarkable and plain. Doubt crept into his thoughts. What if the power had left with Elijah? What if the cloak was just cloth now, stripped of its supernatural ability? What if he stood here alone, abandoned by heaven, clutching empty promises? But then he remembered the whirlwind, the fire horses, the way his master had vanished into glory without fear. The God who had taken Elijah up was the same God who had promised a double portion to those who believed. Elisha raised the cloak above his head. "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he called out across the water. His voice carried both question and declaration, both doubt and faith wrestling together in the same breath. He brought the cloak down hard against the surface. The river stopped flowing. Water gathered itself into walls on either side, leaving a path of dry ground straight across. Fish hung suspended in liquid walls, their silver bodies catching sunlight. Stones that hadn't seen air in centuries lay exposed and gleaming. Elisha stared in wonder. The miracle had happened again, not because of the cloak itself, but because of the God who honored faith expressed through simple acts of obedience. The double portion was real. He stepped onto the riverbed with growing confidence. His feet found purchase on smooth stones. The sound of held-back water surrounded him like a gentle roar. Above his head, walls of river water caught and scattered light in dancing patterns. This was his first miracle as a prophet in his own right. Not Elijah's student anymore, but Elisha the prophet, the one called to carry God's power to a broken world. Each step across the dry riverbed confirmed his new identity. On the far shore, a group of men waited. The sons of the prophets from Jericho had been watching from a distance. They had seen Elijah taken up. They had witnessed the river part twice in one day. Now they looked at Elisha with new eyes. "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha," one whispered to another. Word spread quickly among them. Their voices carried awe and recognition. The mantle of prophecy had passed to worthy hands. But some struggled to accept what they had seen. Death was supposed to be final. People didn't just disappear into whirlwinds. Surely Elijah's body had fallen somewhere. Surely the wind had carried him to some remote valley where he lay injured or unconscious. 50 strong men approached Elisha with a proposal. "Let us go and search for your master," they said. "Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and set him down on some mountain or in some valley." Elisha shook his head. He had seen his teacher ascend into heaven itself. No earthly search would find what had passed beyond the physical realm. "Don't send them," he said gently but firmly, yet they persisted. 50 men with good intentions but limited understanding. They begged and pleaded until Elisha finally agreed. "Send them," he said, knowing their search would prove futile, but hoping their failure might teach them about the mysteries of God. 3 days they searched, up mountains and down valleys, through caves and across ridges. They looked in every place a body might fall or hide or rest. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. When they returned empty-handed, Elisha received them with kindness. "Didn't I tell you not to go?" he said without pride or rebuke. Sometimes people need to discover truth through their own experience rather than through the words of others. The failed search served its purpose. The 50 men now understood that something unprecedented had occurred. Elijah hadn't been relocated. He had been translated, taken from earth to heaven without passing through death's doorway. This knowledge spread through the schools of prophets. From Jericho to Bethel to Gilgal, men shared the incredible story. The God of Israel had done something new, a servant so faithful that death itself had been bypassed. For Elisha, the returned searchers brought closure. No more questions about his master's fate, no more wondering if the whirlwind had been real. The failed search confirmed what his heart already knew. Elijah was beyond human reach now, dwelling in realms where only spirits could follow. The cloak in his hands felt different now. Not just a piece of fabric passed from teacher to student, but a symbol of divine appointment. God had chosen him to continue Elijah's work. The river parting had been proof of heaven's blessing on the transition. As evening approached, Elisha walked toward Jericho. Behind him, the Jordan flowed peacefully, keeping its secrets. Ahead lay a city full of people with problems only God could solve. His work was just beginning. The double portion wasn't about performing twice as many miracles as Elijah. It was about inheriting the fullness of his master's spiritual authority, the power to stand between heaven and earth, carrying divine solutions to human struggles. Night fell gently over the valley. Stars appeared one by one, distant lights in the gathering darkness. Somewhere among those stars, Elisha believed his teacher dwelt in glory. The thought brought comfort and courage for the journey ahead. Healing a spring, Jericho slept peacefully under starlight when Elisha arrived. The ancient city had known many changes, walls falling to trumpet blasts, curses pronounced and lifted, generations rising and falling within its boundaries. Now it faced a quieter crisis, one that threatened life slowly rather than dramatically. Morning brought the city's elders to Elisha's door. Their faces showed worry etched by months of growing concern. "Our Lord," they said with respect, "this city sits in a pleasant place, as you can see, but the water is bad and the land is unproductive." Elisha followed them through Jericho's streets. Children played in dusty courtyards, women swept their doorsteps, men prepared for another day of hard work. Life continued, but shadows of hardship lingered beneath the surface routines. They led him to the spring that supplied water for the entire city. It bubbled up from deep underground, a natural fountain that should have been a source of blessing. Instead, it carried poison in its flow. The water looked clear enough, sparkling in the morning sun. But animals who drank from it sickened. Crops watered from this source withered before they could produce fruit. The life-giving spring had become a source of slow death. Elisha knelt beside the water and cupped some in his palm. It smelled wrong, not the fresh scent of pure water, but something bitter and harsh. The minerals dissolved in it turned blessing into curse, making the spring useless for the very purpose God had designed. "Bring me a new bowl," he said to the waiting men. "Put salt in it." His request seemed strange. Salt usually made water less drinkable, not more. But the elders had seen the Jordan part the day before. They trusted this young prophet's unusual methods. They returned quickly with a clay bowl, newly made and never used. Coarse salt filled it, the kind used for preserving meat and cleaning wounds. White crystals caught the light like tiny diamonds. Elisha took the bowl and walked to the source of the spring. Here, water bubbled up from hidden depths, carrying whatever contamination lay buried in the earth below. This was where healing needed to begin, at the very heart of the problem. He poured the salt directly into the bubbling source. The crystals dissolved instantly, disappearing into the upwelling water. For a moment, nothing seemed different. The spring continued flowing as it had for months. Then Elisha spoke words that carried heaven's authority. "This is what the Lord says. I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive." The change wasn't visible at first. Water doesn't announce its healing with fanfare or dramatic signs, but something fundamental shifted in that moment. The poison that had infected the spring disappeared, neutralized by God's power working through simple salt. Within hours, the difference became clear. Animals approached the spring without hesitation, drinking deeply with no ill effects. The water tasted clean and fresh. Plants that had been struggling began to show new life. Word spread through Jericho like ripples from a thrown stone. The spring was healed. The curse was broken. Life could flourish again in their pleasant city. Children ran to taste the water. Adults filled jars with new confidence. But the real miracle wasn't just the healing itself. It was the method God chose. Salt, the most common preservative, had become an agent of restoration. The ordinary transformed by divine purpose into something extraordinary. This gentleness marked Elisha's ministry from the beginning. Where Elijah had called down fire from heaven, Elisha brought healing through everyday elements. His power worked quietly, restoring rather than destroying, mending what was broken rather than breaking what stood. The salt had done more than heal the water. It represented a new kind of prophetic ministry, one that seasoned life with hope instead of judgment. Elisha would be the prophet who made bitter things sweet, who brought life where death had reigned. Months passed and the spring never failed. Seasons changed, but the water remained pure and life-giving. The healing proved permanent, a lasting sign of God's faithfulness to his promises. What he restored stayed restored. Children who had never known clean water grew strong drinking from the healed spring. Crops flourished in fields watered by its flow. The land that had been unproductive began yielding abundance. Jericho prospered in ways that couldn't be measured in gold or silver. The miracle became part of the city's story, passed down from parents to children. "Remember when the spring was bitter," they would say. "Remember when the prophet came with salt and spoke God's word. Remember how everything changed." For Elisha, this first miracle in his hometown established patterns that would define his entire ministry. He would be the prophet of restoration, the one who brought God's healing to everyday problems. Not through dramatic confrontations, but through gentle interventions that restored life's natural rhythms. The empty bowl sat in his dwelling as a reminder. Such a simple vessel, used for such a profound purpose. It spoke of how God could use anyone, anything, to accomplish his will. No tool was too common, no person too ordinary, when heaven chose to work through them. The elders of Jericho visited Elisha regularly after that, bringing news of the spring's continued purity. Each report confirmed what they had witnessed, God's power working through his chosen servant to heal what seemed beyond repair. As night fell over the city, families drew water for evening meals without worry. The spring bubbled peacefully, its sound like gentle laughter after months of carrying sadness. Clean water flowed toward every home, carrying life instead of death. Elisha listened to that sound as he prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve as God's agent of healing. But tonight, Jericho rested easy, knowing their spring ran pure and their prophet walked among them with heaven's authority in his hands. Bears and mockers. The road from Jericho wound upward through rocky hills toward Bethel. Elisha walked alone, his staff clicking against stones with each measured step. The morning sun cast long shadows across the path as he made his way to the ancient city where God's people had once worshipped at altars built by their fathers. Bethel held deep significance in Israel's history. Here, Jacob had seen angels ascending and descending a heavenly ladder. Here, God had promised to be with his people wherever they went. But recent years had brought corruption to this holy place. Golden calves now stood where pure worship once flourished. As Elisha approached the city's outskirts, sounds of young voices carried on the wind. A group of boys had gathered near the road, perhaps 20 or 30 of them, ranging in age from children to young men. They had been waiting, it seemed, watching for the prophet's arrival. When they spotted him cresting the hill, their voices rose in unified mockery. "Go on up, you bald head," they shouted with cruel laughter. "Go on up, you bald head." The words cut deeper than simple name-calling. "Go on up" referred to Elijah's recent ascension, something these young people had heard about and chosen to ridicule. They weren't just mocking Elisha's appearance. They were mocking the very power of God that had taken his master into heaven. Elisha stopped walking. The jeering continued, growing bolder with each taunt. Some of the boys threw pebbles that scattered dust around his feet. Others made crude gestures, their faces twisted with contempt for the man they saw as powerless and foolish. This wasn't innocent childhood teasing. These were young people old enough to understand respect, old enough to know better than to mock God's appointed servant. Their behavior reflected the spiritual corruption that had infected Bethel itself, a city that had once known God but now embraced rebellion. The prophet turned to face his tormentors. His eyes held no anger, but something far more sobering, the weight of divine authority. When heaven's representative is scorned, heaven itself takes notice. "In the name of the Lord," Elisha pronounced, his voice carrying across the hillside with quiet power. The mockery stopped. Sudden silence replaced the cruel laughter as his words settled over them like a heavy blanket. The boys looked at each other uncertainly. Something in the prophet's voice had changed the atmosphere. The morning air grew still. Even the birds stopped singing. Creation itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came sounds from the nearby forest. Branches breaking, heavy footsteps, low growling that raised hair on the back of necks. 2 bears emerged from the trees, their massive forms moving with surprising speed toward the group of mockers. The laughter turned to screams. The young people scattered in every direction, but bears moved faster than running boys. The animals struck with devastating efficiency, their claws and teeth finding their targets with precise force. When it was over, 42 of the mockers lay injured, some severely wounded, others bearing marks they would carry for life. The bears disappeared back into the forest as suddenly as they had come, leaving behind a scene that would be talked about for generations. Elisha felt no satisfaction in what had happened. This wasn't revenge. It was divine judgment on those who had chosen to despise God's authority. The bears had come not because a man felt insulted, but because heaven's honor had been trampled underfoot. The few boys who had escaped injury ran back toward Bethel, their voices raised in panic and pain. Word spread quickly through the city. The new prophet was not a man to be trifled with. The same God who had taken Elijah up in fiery chariots had sent bears to defend his servant's honor. This incident would define how people approached Elisha for the rest of his ministry. Word traveled to every city in Israel. Mock God's prophet at your own peril. The gentle man who healed springs with salt could also call down judgment on those who scorned divine authority. But the bears served a larger purpose than punishment. They demonstrated that God's power was not confined to dramatic miracles performed by willing prophets. Even wild animals obeyed the voice of heaven when earthly authority was challenged. The wounded boys would recover, but their scars would remind them and others that some boundaries cannot be crossed without consequence. Respect for God's messengers wasn't optional. It was a matter of spiritual life and death. Death. News of the incident reached King Joram in Samaria within days. Palace officials whispered among themselves about the new prophet who commanded both healing springs and avenging bears. Even skeptics began to wonder if this Elisha might possess power beyond ordinary understanding. The religious leaders in Bethel took notice too. Their golden calves suddenly seemed less impressive when compared to a god who could send forest animals to defend his honor. Some began to question whether their worship practices might need reconsideration. For Elisha, the morning's events brought no joy. He had not sought to harm these young people, but he understood that his role as prophet required him to uphold divine authority, even when it led to painful consequences for those who chose rebellion over respect. The road to Bethel stretched ahead, quieter now. No more mockers waited to test his resolve. The city's gates stood open, but the people watching from walls and windows looked upon him with new eyes, eyes that held both fear and dawning respect. As he entered Bethel, Elisha reflected on the morning's harsh lesson. God's mercy was real and abundant, flowing like healed springs to those who received it gladly. But his justice was equally real, swift as bears from the forest when his honor was despised. The balance between mercy and judgment would mark every day of his prophetic ministry. He would heal the hurting and restore the broken, but he would also stand firm when divine authority was challenged. Both aspects served the same purpose, calling people back to the God who loved them enough to discipline them. Behind him, the forest grew quiet again. The bears had returned to their natural rhythms, their unusual service complete, but the memory of their swift appearance would linger in Bethel for years to come, a reminder that God's prophets walked under heaven's protection. 3 kings and a prophet. The message came at dawn, carried by a breathless messenger whose horse had traveled through the night. 3 kings needed a prophet's wisdom. Their situation was desperate, their armies dying of thirst in a desert that offered no relief. King Joram of Israel had convinced King Jehoshaphat of Judah to join him in war against Moab. The Moabites had rebelled, refusing to pay their tribute of sheep and wool. It seemed like a simple matter: march south, defeat the rebels, and restore proper order. King Jehoshaphat had suggested bringing the king of Edom as their third ally. More soldiers meant quicker victory, or so they reasoned. The combined armies would surely overwhelm any resistance Moab could mount. But their chosen route had led them through wilderness that stretched beyond their maps and calculations. 7 days of marching under relentless sun had consumed their water supplies. Now, 3 armies faced death not from enemy swords, but from thirst. Elisha found the kings camped in a barren valley where no spring bubbled and no well offered hope. Tens of thousands of soldiers sat in whatever shade they could find, their tongues thick and their strength fading. Horses hung their heads in exhaustion. The army was becoming a graveyard. King Joram spoke first, his voice cracked with desperation. Has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to deliver us into the hands of Moab? Fear had replaced his earlier confidence. The son of Ahab suddenly saw his father's enemies in every shadow. Elisha looked at this grandson of Omri with eyes that saw past royal robes to the heart beneath. "Why do you come to me?" he asked. "Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother." His words carried pointed reminder. This was the family that had promoted Baal worship throughout Israel. But Jehoshaphat, the godly king of Judah, stood between them. His presence changed everything. "No," Joram replied, his desperation overriding pride. "It was the Lord who called us 3 kings together to deliver us into the hands of Moab." The prophet's expression softened slightly when he looked at Jehoshaphat. Here was a king who still honored the God of their fathers, who sought divine guidance instead of trusting in political alliances alone. Surely, as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I did not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not pay any attention to you. Elisha's next request surprised everyone present. "Bring me a harpist," he commanded. Music seemed irrelevant when armies were dying of thirst. But the prophet understood something about connecting with divine inspiration that the kings had never learned. A skilled musician was found among the soldiers, perhaps a Levite who served in temple worship, now conscripted for war. His fingers found familiar strings, and gentle melodies began to flow across the desperate camp. The music created space for heaven's voice to be heard above the chaos of human need. As the harpist played, something shifted in Elisha's countenance. The hand of the Lord came upon him, that mysterious touch that opened prophetic vision and revealed divine solutions to impossible problems. His eyes took on a distant look, seeing beyond the physical realm into God's plans. "This is what the Lord says," Elisha began, his voice carrying new authority. "I will fill this valley with pools of water. You will see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and your other animals will drink." The promise seemed impossible. Valleys didn't fill with water without storms. Springs didn't appear overnight in desert places. But the God who had parted rivers and healed bitter springs could certainly provide water in waterless places. "This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord," the prophet continued. "He will also deliver Moab into your hands. You will overthrow every fortified city and every major town. You will cut down every good tree, stop up all the springs, and ruin every good field with stones." The next morning brought fulfillment beyond their wildest hopes. Sunrise revealed pools of clear water standing throughout the valley. Not puddles, but deep reservoirs that reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. No storm had passed, no rain had fallen, yet water covered the ground as far as eyes could see. The armies drank deeply, their strength returning with each swallow. Horses plunged their muzzles into the cool water, drinking until their sides bulged. Pack animals carried their fill. What had been a death valley became an oasis of life. But the miracle served a second purpose beyond saving the Allied armies. The morning sun striking those pools of water created an illusion that would decide the battle before it began. Across the border, Moabite scouts reported strange news to their king. The valley where their enemies camped appeared to be filled with blood. Water reflecting red in the dawn light looked like massive pools of gore spread across the desert floor. "The kings have fought among themselves," the Moabites concluded with excitement. "Their armies must have turned on each other during the night. Now they're all dead and their wealth lies unguarded." Instead of preparing for battle, the Moabites rushed toward what they thought would be easy plunder. They came as scavengers rather than soldiers, thinking only of the treasure they would claim from the scattered dead. The trap was perfect. When the Moabites reached the valley, they found not corpses, but living armies rested and ready for war. The pools that had appeared to be blood were clearly water now, but the deception had served its purpose. Moab's forces were scattered and unprepared when the battle began. The victory was complete and overwhelming. Just as Elisha had prophesied, every fortified city fell. Trees that had grown for decades were cut down. Springs were stopped up. Good fields were ruined with stones. Moab learned the cost of rebelling against the God of Israel. For the three kings, the campaign became a lesson in divine power that none would forget. Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem with renewed faith in the God who could create water in deserts and victory from impossible situations. Even Joram, son of the wicked Ahab, had witnessed something that shook his confidence in Baal worship. The prophet he had initially dismissed had delivered 3 armies from certain death and given them complete victory over their enemies. The dry valley where they had faced death became a permanent reminder of God's provision. Local people would point to the pools that appeared and tell the story for generations. When the impossible became reality, it left marks that time couldn't erase. The widow's oil. The woman came at evening when shadows stretched long across Elisha's courtyard. Her clothes spoke of poverty, recently arrived. Fabric that had once been fine now showed careful mending and the gentle shabbiness of reduced circumstances. But dignity remained in her bearing, the quiet strength of someone fighting honorable battles. "Your servant, my husband, is dead," she began, her voice steady despite the grief still fresh in her eyes. "And you know that he revered the Lord, but now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Elisha knew her husband well, one of the sons of the prophets who had served God faithfully despite receiving little earthly reward for his devotion. Such men often died young, worn out by the demands of spiritual service and the hardships of living by faith rather than worldly wisdom. The creditor's claim was legal under current law. When a man died owing money, his family's options were limited: Property could be sold, possessions seized, and if these didn't satisfy the debt, children could be taken as bondservants until the obligation was worked off through their labor. For a widow, losing her sons meant losing everything. They were her only hope for provision in old age, her only protection in a society that offered little security for women alone. Without them, she faced a future of begging or slow starvation. "How can I help you?" Elisha asked, though he could see her poverty written in every detail of her appearance. "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" The question seemed cruel at first. If she had anything of value, surely she would have sold it already to pay her debts. But the prophet had learned to look for seeds of miracle in the smallest beginnings. "Your servant has nothing there at all," she replied, then paused as if searching her memory. "Except a small jar of olive oil. Such a tiny thing, barely enough oil to cook one meal or light a lamp for a few hours." In a household stripped bare by creditors, this single jar had somehow been overlooked or deemed too worthless to claim. Yet in God's economy, the smallest seed could yield the greatest harvest. "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars," Elisha instructed. "Don't ask for just a few. Gather as many as you can find, from every house, every family willing to lend them." The woman stared at him in confusion. Empty jars served no obvious purpose when the problem was lack of substance to fill them. But she had come seeking miracle, and prophets sometimes gave strange instructions that made sense only in retrospect. "Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons," he continued. "Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, set it aside." Faith required action, even when the action seemed foolish by ordinary standards. The widow bowed respectfully and went to do as the prophet commanded. If God's man said empty jars could solve her problem, then empty jars she would gather. She spent the next day visiting every neighbor, explaining her need without shame. "May I borrow your empty jars?" she asked at door after door. "The prophet has told me to collect as many as possible." The neighbors responded with surprising generosity. Perhaps they remembered her husband's kindness, or maybe desperation in her voice touched their hearts. Jars began arriving at her house, clay vessels of every size and shape, clean and ready for whatever use she intended. When evening came, her small dwelling overflowed with borrowed containers. Large storage jars stood beside smaller vessels used for daily cooking. Wine jars waited next to water pots. The collection filled every available space, an army of emptiness waiting to be filled. The widow gathered her 2 sons around her. "The prophet said to shut the door," she reminded them. This miracle, whatever form it took, would happen in private. No crowd would witness. No fanfare would announce. Just a desperate mother and her children, surrounded by empty jars and armed with impossible hope. She picked up her tiny vessel of oil and began to pour. The golden liquid flowed into the first jar, more than her small container should have held. She kept pouring, and the oil kept flowing far beyond what physics should allow. The first jar filled completely. Her little vessel still showed oil remaining. She moved to the second jar, then the third. Each container received its full measure, while her original supply seemed untouched by what it had given. Her sons watched in growing amazement as jar after jar filled with pure olive oil. The small room began to smell like an olive press at harvest time. Golden liquid caught lamplight and threw dancing reflections on the walls. "Bring me another jar," she called to her older son when one vessel was filled. He handed her the next container, his eyes wide with wonder. The oil continued flowing as if her tiny jar contained an ocean of liquid gold. Hours passed. The work continued. Every borrowed vessel received its portion until the small house held nothing but full jars of oil. Rich, pure olive oil that could be sold in any market for good prices. Finally, when the last jar had been filled to its brim, the widow looked around for another container. None remained empty. Every vessel had received its measure. Only then did her original jar run dry, its supernatural supply exhausted precisely when no more containers waited to receive. "The oil stopped," she whispered to her sons, though they could see it for themselves. The miracle had boundaries, not because God's power was limited, but because her faith had been measured by the number of jars she had gathered. The next morning she hurried to Elisha with news of the night's wonder. "I did as you said," she reported breathlessly. "Every jar is full. The oil flowed until no empty vessels remained." The prophet smiled at her excitement. "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts," he instructed. "You and your sons can live on what is left." The sale brought more money than she had dared hope. High-quality olive oil commanded premium prices, and she had jars upon jars to offer. The debt that had threatened to enslave her children was paid in full with money left over for their future needs. Her sons remained free, their inheritance preserved. The creditor received his due without complaint. Justice was satisfied, mercy had triumphed, and a family that had faced destruction found itself secure and provided for. The empty jars were returned to their owners with grateful thanks. But the story of their filling spread through every household that had contributed vessels. The neighbors who had shown kindness by lending containers became witnesses to God's faithfulness. Word reached other widows facing similar hardships. If God could multiply oil for one desperate mother, perhaps he would show mercy to others in need. Hope began to grow in places where despair had taken root. For Elisha, this miracle revealed patterns that would mark his entire ministry. God's power worked through ordinary objects, springs and salt, cloaks and bears, oil and empty jars. The supernatural touched the natural world at points where faith met desperate need. The widow's oil also demonstrated divine mathematics. Where human calculation saw scarcity, heaven saw abundance. A small jar became a fountain. Empty vessels became instruments of blessing. Need became the occasion for overwhelming provision. Years later, when her sons had grown to manhood and established families of their own, the widow would still tell the story of the night when oil flowed like water. The miracle had saved their lives, but its memory continued blessing them long after the last jar was sold. She kept one small vessel as a reminder, not the original jar that had held the supernatural supply, but one of the containers that had been filled that miraculous evening. When grandchildren visited, she would show them the ordinary clay pot and tell them about the night when God made empty things full. The Shunammite woman. The road from Mount Carmel to Samaria passed through Shunem, a prosperous town where well-built houses lined clean streets and merchants conducted business in the shade of flourishing trees. Here lived a woman whose generosity would earn her a place in the sacred stories told for generations. She was wealthy by any measure, not just in gold or land, but in the deeper riches of wisdom and kindness. Her husband was well respected in the community, their household well managed, their reputation spotless. Yet something was missing from their comfortable life. When Elisha first passed through Shunem, the woman noticed him immediately. Something about the way he carried himself marked him as different from ordinary travelers. His clothes were simple but clean, his manner peaceful but purposeful. She sensed holiness in his presence. "Come and have a meal," she urged when she saw him walking past her gate. Hospitality was sacred duty in their culture, but her invitation carried warmth beyond mere obligation. She genuinely wanted to serve this holy man of God. The meal she provided was generous and carefully prepared. Fresh bread, tender meat, vegetables from her own garden, wine aged in her cellars. She served it with quiet joy, asking nothing in return except the privilege of showing kindness to God's servant. Elisha accepted her hospitality gratefully. The food was excellent, the conversation pleasant, the home peaceful, after long days of traveling dusty roads and staying in rough accommodations. When he continued his journey, he carried memories of genuine warmth, but the woman's kindness didn't end with that single meal. Each time the prophet passed through Shunem, she invited him to stop and eat. What began as occasional hospitality became regular provision. Her table was always ready when God's servant came to town. "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God," she said to her husband one evening after Elisha had departed. "Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." The husband agreed readily. His wife's spiritual insights had proven reliable over years of marriage. If she recognized holiness in this traveling prophet, then they should provide for his needs as generously as possible. They built the upper room carefully, making it comfortable but not luxurious. A simple bed for rest, a table for meals or writing, a chair for sitting, a lamp for light. Everything a traveling prophet might need for refreshment and study during his journeys. When Elisha next visited Shunem, they showed him the prepared room. "This is for you," the woman explained simply. "A quiet place to rest whenever your travels bring you our way." The prophet was deeply moved by this thoughtful gift. Many people offered meals or temporary shelter, but few understood the deeper need for a peaceful retreat where God's servant could pray and prepare for the work ahead. The upper room became a sanctuary for Elisha. Here, he could withdraw from crowds and pressures, seeking God's guidance in solitude. The lamp provided light for reading sacred scrolls. The table held his simple meals. The bed offered rest for his weary body. "What can be done for this woman?" Elisha asked his servant Gehazi one day as they enjoyed the refuge she had provided. Such extraordinary kindness deserved recognition and reward. "She has taken great pains to provide for us." Gehazi had been observing their hostess with practical eyes. "Well, she has no son, and her husband is old," he noted. The servant understood the pain that shadowed this prosperous household, the emptiness that all their wealth couldn't fill. In a culture where sons provided security and carried on family names, childlessness was more than personal sorrow. It meant isolation in old age, the end of family lineage, and constant worry about the future. Even great wealth couldn't solve this deepest need. Elisha called the woman to stand in the doorway of his upper room. She came readily, probably expecting some request for additional provisions or perhaps news of his departure plans. "About this time next year," he said, looking directly into her eyes, "you will hold a son in your arms." The words hit her like physical blows. This was the one promise she had learned not to hope for. The blessing she had accepted would never come. Years of disappointment had taught her to protect her heart from such possibilities. "No, my lord," she objected quickly. "Please, man of God, don't mislead your servant." The pain in her voice revealed how deeply this subject wounded her. False hope felt crueler than honest despair. But Elisha spoke with prophetic certainty, not wishful thinking. God had revealed his intentions for this generous woman. Her kindness to his servant would be rewarded with the gift she treasured most, but had never dared ask for. The months that followed tested her faith daily. Could she trust the prophet's promise? Dare she hope for something she had wanted so desperately for so long? Her body began to show signs that seemed impossible after years of barrenness. When spring arrived and her time came near, she hardly dared believe what was happening. But labor pains don't lie, and the child growing within her was undeniably real. The prophet's word was being fulfilled exactly as he had spoken. The birth was normal and healthy. She held her son in trembling arms, counting his tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the miracle of his existence. The upper room where the promise had been given seemed to echo with thanksgiving. Her husband wept openly when he first held their child. Advanced age had made fatherhood seem impossible, but God's power had overruled natural limitations. Their household, once marked by quiet sadness, now rang with laughter and hope. The boy grew strong and healthy, bringing joy that multiplied with each passing day. His first steps, first words, first attempts to help with household tasks, every milestone was precious beyond measure to parents who had thought such experiences would never be theirs. Elisha continued using the upper room during his travels, but now his visits included playing with the child whose existence demonstrated God's faithfulness. The prophet who had announced the boy's coming watched him grow with paternal pride. The woman's faith deepened through motherhood. She had learned that God's promises, however impossible they seemed, could be trusted completely. The child playing in her courtyard was living proof that heaven heard the prayers of faithful hearts. Years passed peacefully in the comfortable house at Shunem. The boy grew tall and strong, helping his father in the fields during harvest time. The upper room remained ready for the prophet's visits, a continuing symbol of hospitality rewarded beyond imagination. But trials were coming that would test this family's faith in ways they couldn't foresee. The child who had brought such joy would soon become the center of their greatest crisis, and the woman's relationship with God's prophet would face its ultimate test. The boy lives again harvest season had arrived in Shunem, with its familiar rhythms of hard work and hopeful expectation. The Shunammite woman's son had grown into a healthy boy who loved nothing more than following his father into the fields where reapers cut grain under the blazing sun. The morning started like countless others during harvest time. The boy ran ahead of the workers, his young energy endless as he darted between the standing grain. His laughter carried across the fields, mixing with the sounds of scythes cutting through stalks and voices calling out across the rows. But as the sun climbed higher and the heat grew intense, something went wrong. The boy suddenly pressed his hands to his head, crying out in pain that came without warning or apparent cause. "My head! My head!" he screamed, his small voice cutting through the noise of harvest work. The reapers stopped their cutting. His father dropped his tools and ran to where his son had fallen to his knees among the grain. The man lifted his boy carefully, feeling the fever that burned through his small body. This wasn't ordinary tiredness from playing in the sun. So something serious was happening, something that sent ice through a father's heart despite the desert heat around them. "Carry him to his mother," the father instructed one of his servants. The familiar comfort of home and his mother's care seemed the only hope for relief from whatever had struck so suddenly and severely. The servant ran through the fields carrying the precious burden, the boy's head lolling against his shoulder. Each step seemed to make the child's condition worse. His breathing grew shallow, his skin burned with unnatural heat. The woman met them at her door, taking one look at her son and understanding immediately that this was no minor illness. She carried him up to the upper room, the quiet sanctuary where Elisha stayed during his visits, the place where this boy's life had first been promised. She laid him gently on the prophet's bed, the same piece of furniture where God's servant rested during his travels. Perhaps some blessing lingered here. Perhaps the holy man's presence had sanctified this space in ways that could help her dying child. The boy's breathing grew more labored. His fever climbed higher. She knelt beside the bed, holding his burning hands in hers, watching helplessly as life ebbed away from the miracle child she had never expected to receive. At midday, he stopped breathing entirely. His small chest no longer rose and fell. His hands grew still in hers. The son promised by God's prophet, the child who had brought such joy to their household, lay dead on the bed where his life had been foretold. She closed his eyes tenderly and arranged his limbs in peaceful repose. Then she shut the door of the upper room and went down to find her husband. Her face showed such determined calm that he sensed something momentous had happened. "Send me one of the servants and a donkey," she said quietly. "I need to go to the man of God quickly and return." Her husband looked puzzled. Today was neither new moon nor Sabbath, the usual times for seeking out prophets or making religious journeys. "Why go to him today?" he asked, not understanding the urgency in her voice. "It's all right," she replied, giving him no details about what lay behind the closed door upstairs. Some conversations could wait. Some crises required immediate action rather than lengthy explanations. The servant prepared a donkey quickly, understanding from her manner that speed was essential. She mounted and set off toward Mount Carmel, where Elisha was known to spend time in prayer and solitude. "Go fast," she urged the servant, leading her mount. "Don't slow down unless I tell you to." The miles between Shunem and Carmel had never seemed so long. Every moment of delay felt like betrayal of the child lying still in the upper room. Elisha spotted her coming while she was still far off. Something about her urgent approach sent warning signals through his prophetic consciousness. This was not a social visit or routine consultation. "Look," he said to his servant Gehazi, "there's the Shunammite. Run to meet her and ask her, 'Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right?'" Gehazi hurried down the mountainside to intercept her before she reached the prophet. His questions came breathlessly as he caught up with her donkey. "Everything is all right," she replied, but her eyes looked past him toward Elisha, waiting on the mountain. Her answer was technically true. In God's economy, where death might not be final, everything could still be all right. She pressed past Gehazi and climbed the steep path to where Elisha waited. When she reached him, she fell at his feet and caught hold of them, her composure finally breaking under the weight of her grief. Gehazi moved to push her away, thinking her behavior inappropriate for addressing a man of God. But Elisha stopped him with a gesture. "Leave her alone," he said sharply. "She is in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why." Then she spoke the words that explained everything. "Did I ask you for a son, my lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes? The prophet understood immediately. The child was dead. The miracle boy whose birth had demonstrated God's faithfulness now lay lifeless. And the woman who had never asked for a son was drowning in the pain of losing what she had learned to treasure. Elisha turned to Gehazi with urgent instructions. Tuck your cloak into your belt, take my staff in your hand and run. Don't greet anyone you meet, and if anyone greets you, do not answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face. But the woman wouldn't be satisfied with a servant carrying a wooden staff. As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you, she declared. If there was any hope of getting her son back, it lay with the prophet himself, not with his representative. Elisha saw the fierce determination in her eyes and understood. This mother would not be comforted with half measures or delegate solutions. Her faith was in God's power working through his chosen servant, not in symbolic gestures carried by others. Together they made the journey back to Shunem, following the same road the woman had traveled in desperate haste just hours before. Gehazi ran ahead with the staff, but both prophet and mother knew that the real confrontation with death was yet to come. When they reached the house, Gehazi met them with disappointed news. The boy has not awakened, he reported. The staff had failed to restore life. Death still held its grip on the miracle child. Elisha went straight up to the upper room where the boy lay. He closed the door behind him, shutting out all distractions and human expectations. This battle would be fought in private between God's servant and the ultimate enemy. The child lay exactly as his mother had left him, peaceful but lifeless on the prophet's bed. Elisha knelt beside the small form and began to pray, pouring out his heart to the God who had promised this boy's birth and now seemed to have allowed his death. Then he did something remarkable. He lay down on top of the child, putting his mouth on the boy's mouth, his eyes on the boy's eyes, his hands on the boy's hands. Flesh touched flesh. Life reached toward death with desperate intimacy. The child's body began to grow warm, but still no breath came. Elisha got up and walked around the room, praying continuously, then lay on the boy again. This time something stirred within the small frame. Suddenly the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Death released its hold. Breath returned to still lungs. The miracle of resurrection happened quietly in an upper room where no crowds gathered to witness the impossible. Call the Shunammite, Elisha told Gehazi. When she came up the stairs, her heart pounding with hope and fear, the prophet simply said, Take your son. She fell at Elisha's feet in overwhelming gratitude, then gathered her living child into her arms. The boy who had died in the morning was alive in the evening, warm and breathing and completely restored. The resurrection remained their secret initially. Some miracles are too sacred for immediate sharing, but eventually the story spread, adding another layer to Elisha's reputation as a prophet who carried God's power over life and death itself. For the Shunammite woman, the day held lessons that would sustain her faith for the rest of her life. God's gifts might be tested by trials, but his power was greater than any enemy, even death itself. The son she had never asked for had been given twice, and both times the gift came from the same faithful God. Naaman the leper. Far to the north in Damascus, the greatest general of Syria's army faced an enemy no sword could defeat. Naaman commanded respect from kings and fear from enemies, but leprosy had declared war on his flesh, and this battle was one he couldn't win through military strategy. The disease had started small, just a patch of discolored skin that he hoped might fade with time. But leprosy never retreats voluntarily. It advanced steadily, claiming territory on his arms and face, marking him as unclean despite his power and position. In Naaman's household served a young Israelite girl, captured during one of Syria's raids into enemy territory. She had been taken from her family and given to Naaman's wife as a servant, one of thousands of nameless casualties in the endless border wars between nations. This girl had grown up hearing stories about Elisha, the prophet who healed springs and raised dead children. Her faith remained strong despite her captivity. When she saw her master's condition growing worse each day, compassion overcame the natural resentment she might have felt toward her captors. If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, she said to her mistress one day while helping arrange the household. He would cure him of his leprosy. The words carried such conviction that Naaman's wife immediately reported them to her husband. Here was hope from an unexpected source, a slave girl whose people were enemies, yet whose concern seemed genuine and her confidence absolute. Naaman brought the girl's suggestion to the king of Syria, explaining how his young servant claimed that Israel's prophet could heal leprosy. The idea seemed worth pursuing. Losing his greatest general to disease would be a strategic disaster far worse than the cost of investigating on unusual remedies. The Syrian king wrote a letter to the king of Israel. With this letter, I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy. He also sent a fortune in gifts, 10 talents of silver, like 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing fit for royalty. When the Israelite king received the letter and saw the massive tribute, he panicked. "Am I God?" he cried, tearing his robes in distress. "Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." The king's reasoning seemed logical. Syria was looking for an excuse to start another war. When Israel's king inevitably failed to cure Naaman's incurable disease, Syria would claim insult and launch an invasion. The whole situation felt like an elaborate trap, but word of the king's distress reached Elisha quickly. "Why have you torn your robes?" The prophet sent word to ask. "Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Naaman arrived at Elisha's house with great fanfare. Chariots and horses filled the street. Soldiers stood at attention. Servants carried the precious gifts. All of Damascus seemed to have come calling on this humble prophet's doorstep. But instead of rushing out to greet such an important visitor, Elisha remained inside his house. He sent a messenger with simple instructions. "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed." Naaman's face flushed with anger at what seemed like deliberate insult. He had expected ceremony appropriate to his rank. Sacred rituals, dramatic prayers. At minimum, he expected the prophet to come out and acknowledge his presence personally. "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God," Naaman fumed to his servants. "I thought he would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy." The treatment felt even more insulting when he considered the suggested remedy. "Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel?" he demanded. "Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" Damascus boasted clear mountain streams that sparkled like crystal. The Jordan, by comparison, was muddy and unremarkable. If washing in rivers could cure leprosy, surely Syria's superior waters would work better than Israel's murky stream. He turned to leave in disgust, his pride wounded and his hopes dashed. But his servants had served him long enough to speak truth when necessary. These men loved their master more than they feared his anger, and they saw opportunity where he saw insult. "My father," one of them said gently, using the term of endearment that showed both respect and affection. "If the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" The logic was undeniable. Naaman had come prepared to attempt any cure, no matter how difficult or dangerous. Why refuse to try something simply because it seemed too easy? What did he have to lose except his pride? His anger cooled as wisdom penetrated his wounded dignity. These servants had traveled with him across enemy territory, sharing the risks of this desperate journey. Their counsel came from loyalty, not impertinence. "You're right," he admitted finally. "If I was ready to do something difficult, why not try something simple?" The decision to trust came slowly, fighting past layers of wounded pride and cultural superiority. The journey to the Jordan took them through countryside that looked ordinary and unremarkable. No dramatic scenery suggested miraculous power. The river itself, when they reached it, appeared disappointingly normal, just water flowing between muddy banks. Naaman's servants helped him down to the water's edge. His leprosy had progressed to the point where simple movements caused pain. The diseased skin on his arms and face showed the full horror of his condition in daylight. He waded into the river slowly, feeling the cool water rise around his legs. Nothing happened. No tingling sensation, no immediate healing. Just muddy Jordan water swirling around him like any other river. He ducked under completely, then came up counting. 1, The water streamed from his hair and beard. His skin looked exactly as diseased as before. His servants watched anxiously from the bank. Down again. Up again. 2. Still no change. The leprosy patches remained as prominent as ever. Doubt began whispering that this whole journey had been foolish from the beginning. 3 times. 4 times. 5 times. Each immersion tested his faith a little more. His servants' faces showed growing concern. Perhaps the Syrian rivers really would have worked better. Perhaps this prophet was a fraud after all. 6 times under the water. 6 times emerging unchanged. 1 more immersion remained. The final test of whether Israel's God really could heal what Syrian physicians had declared hopeless. Naaman took a deep breath and went under the 7th time. When he came up, gasping and wiping water from his eyes, everything had changed. The diseased patches were gone. His skin looked healthy and clean, like that of a young child. He stared at his arms in amazement. The leprosy that had been advancing steadily for months had vanished completely. Not healed gradually, but removed instantly and perfectly. His flesh was better than it had been before the disease began. His servants shouted with joy, splashing into the river to embrace their master. The man they had watched suffer under leprosy's curse now stood before them completely whole. The humble Jordan had accomplished what Damascus rivers never could. Naaman's heart overflowed with emotions too deep for words. Gratitude to the prophet who had prescribed such a simple cure. Wonder at the God who commanded rivers to heal the incurable. Shame at his earlier pride and resistance to such easy instructions. They returned immediately to Elisha's house, but this time, Naaman came as a changed man in more ways than physical healing. His pride had been washed away, along with his leprosy, replaced by humble recognition of divine power. Now, I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel, he declared to the prophet. So please accept a gift from your servant. But Elisha refused all payment. As surely as the Lord lives whom I serve, I will not accept a thing, he said firmly. Healing came as a gift from God, not as a service to be purchased with gold and silver. Naaman pressed him repeatedly, but the prophet remained unmovable. Finally, the Syrian general made a different request. If you will not accept a gift, please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. The request revealed how completely his worldview had changed. He wanted to take Israelite soil back to Damascus so he could worship Israel's God on Israel's earth. The man who had come seeking physical healing had found spiritual transformation as well. His final request showed the complexity of his position. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow down also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. Elisha understood the diplomat's dilemma. Go in peace, he said, blessing the man who would have to navigate between his new faith and his official duties in a pagan court. Naaman departed with clean skin and a cleansed heart, carrying Israelite earth and Israelite faith back to Syria. The servant girl who had first mentioned the prophet watched him go, her compassionate suggestion having transformed her master's life forever. Bones that breathe years flowed like quiet rivers through the land of Israel. Elisha grew old in service to the God who had called him from behind his plow. His hair whitened with age, his step grew slower, but his faith remained strong, and his reputation as a prophet continued, drawing people from distant places seeking wisdom and miracles. The man who had received a double portion of Elijah's spirit had used it well. Springs had been healed, armies had been saved, widows had been provided for, children had been raised from death. His life read like a catalog of divine intervention in human affairs. But even prophets face mortality. The body that had carried God's power for decades began to show the wear of long service. Elisha felt strength ebbing away like water from a cracked vessel. The time was coming when he would join his master in realms beyond earthly service. King Joash of Israel came to visit when he heard of the prophet's illness. This was the grandson of Jehu, part of a dynasty that had destroyed Ahab's house and eliminated Baal worship from the northern kingdom. He found Elisha lying on his bed, clearly nearing the end of his earthly journey. My father, the king cried, using the same words Elisha had spoken when Elijah was taken up in the whirlwind. The chariots and horsemen of Israel. He understood that losing this prophet would be like losing an entire army's worth of divine protection. Even on his deathbed, Elisha continued serving as God's messenger. He gave the king specific instructions for dealing with Syrian threats, promising victories that would come after the prophet himself had gone to his rest. His final prophetic words carried hope for Israel's future. When death finally came, it arrived gently. No whirlwind appeared to carry Elisha heavenward as it had for Elijah. No fiery chariots descended to transport him to glory. He simply breathed his last breath and passed peacefully into whatever lay beyond the veil. The entire nation mourned his passing. From the royal palace to the humblest village homes, people remembered how this gentle prophet had touched their lives. Stories were told and retold of his miracles, his wisdom, his compassion for the hurting and helpless. They buried him in a tomb carved from rock, the kind of resting place reserved for honored men. The cave was sealed with a great stone, and Elisha's earthly work seemed finished. His bones lay in darkness, waiting for resurrection's dawn, like all who have died in faith. But God wasn't finished with his servant yet. The next spring brought raiders from Moab, as they came every year when the weather made travel easier. These weren't organized armies, but bands of robbers who swept across the border looking for quick plunder before retreating to their own territory. A group of Israelites was conducting a burial when Moabite raiders appeared on the horizon. The funeral party panicked, knowing they couldn't outrun mounted bandits while carrying a corpse. They needed to hide immediately or face capture and death. Elisha's tomb lay nearby, its stone entrance partially opened for some reason. Perhaps recent visitors had come to honor the prophet's memory. In their desperation, the mourners decided to hide the body they were burying in the first available place. They pushed aside the stone and quickly lowered their dead friend into the prophet's resting place. There was no time for proper ceremony or respectful placement. They simply needed to get the body out of sight before the raiders arrived. The corpse touched Elisha's bones in the darkness of the tomb. Dead flesh made contact with the remains of the man who had raised the dead during his lifetime. Power that had never departed from those bones flowed into the fresh corpse. Suddenly, the dead man stood up, very much alive and breathing. Death released its hold instantly and completely. The mourners stared in shock as their friend climbed out of the tomb under his own power, confused but undeniably living. The Moabite raiders thundered past, unaware that they had witnessed the most remarkable grave robbery in history. What they thought was a group of frightened mourners hiding from them was actually a crowd witnessing the final miracle of Elisha's ministry. Even in death, the prophet's bones carried resurrection power. The same God who had worked through his living hands continued working through his remains. Death itself couldn't stop the flow of divine life that had marked his entire ministry. The man who had been raised spread the incredible story throughout Israel. Word traveled from village to village about the prophet whose very bones could bring the dead back to life. Elisha's reputation for miraculous power only grew after his death. People began making pilgrimages to the tomb, hoping to receive healing or blessing from the place where such power lingered. The cave that held the prophet's bones became a shrine, a reminder that God's servants carried his authority even beyond the grave. For the man who had been raised, life took on new meaning. He had crossed the boundary between life and death and returned to tell about it. Every sunrise was a gift, every breath a miracle, every day an opportunity to serve the God who had brought him back. The resurrection also served as a sign to Israel about the nature of their God. Other nations worshiped deities whose power ended at the grave. But Israel's God ruled over death itself, able to restore life even through the bones of his faithful servants. Elisha's final miracle pointed forward to greater resurrections yet to come. If a prophet's bones could raise the dead, what might the power of God's own Son accomplish when he conquered death completely? The tomb in Israel became a preview of an empty tomb in Jerusalem. The story spread beyond Israel's borders, reaching even the courts of foreign kings. The nation that possessed prophets whose bones could resurrect the dead clearly served a God worth respecting or fearing. Elisha's posthumous miracle became part of Israel's reputation among the nations. Years passed, and the prophet's bones continued resting in their cave. But the power demonstrated there lived on in the memories and faith of God's people. They had seen proof that their almighty creator was stronger than humanity's final enemy. When they faced their own deaths, believers remembered the man who had touched Elisha's bones and lived again. If God could raise the dead through a prophet's remains, surely he could raise his faithful servants when their time came to face eternity. The bones of Elisha became a symbol of hope that transcended the grave. Death was not the end of the story for those who served the living God. Life had the final word, and resurrection was always possible for the one who had breathed life into dust from the beginning. In the darkness of that tomb, surrounded by the silence of death, power flowed from bones to flesh and brought morning to a man's longest night. The miracle was quiet, witnessed by few, but its implications echoed through eternity. Even death could not silence the voice of God's faithful prophet.